Section 1. The first vaults before there were locks. There is something about a locked door that has always made people want to know what is on the other side. Not out of greed necessarily, something quieter than that. It is more like the feeling you get when you walk past a house with all its curtains drawn at midday. Some primal part of you wonders. Some part of you leans toward it without meaning to. Vaults have existed, in one form or another, for as long as human beings have had something worth protecting. And the more you look at the full history of them, the more you realize that the things worth protecting have never really been just gold or gemstones. The most carefully guarded places in history have held knowledge, identity, power, and sometimes fear itself. The story starts much further back than you might expect. Long before anyone thought to forge a steel door or spin a combination dial, the ancient world was already in the business of concealment. The earliest vaults were not man-made chambers at all. They were natural caves, deep niches in cliff faces, hollowed spaces beneath boulders where the early human instinct for secrecy and protection found a ready home. Archaeological evidence suggests that as far back as 40,000 years ago, people in what is now southern France were hiding pigments, bones, and ritual objects in tight recesses within cave systems, places that required effort to reach, places where only the initiated would know to look. That instinct did not go away. It evolved. By the time the great civilizations of Mesopotamia were rising along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the concept of a dedicated vault, a built space specifically designed to hold and protect, was already well established. The temples of Sumer, constructed in the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, functioned partly as treasuries. The priests who controlled access to the inner sanctums of these temples were among the most powerful people in the ancient world, and their power rested, at least partly, on their exclusive relationship to whatever lay sealed inside. Grain, metal ingots, records carved into clay tablets, ritual objects of sacred significance. These were the currencies of civilization, and they were kept behind walls that most people would never be permitted to pass. What is fascinating about this period is that the vault and the temple were, in many ways, the same thing. The sacred and the financial were inseparable. To hold the treasure was to hold divine authority. To breach the vault was not just theft. It was blasphemy. The Egyptians understood this completely. When you think about ancient Egypt and vaults, the mind goes immediately to the burial chambers of the pharaohs, those deep-cut rooms beneath tons of limestone and granite, sealed with immense effort and guarded by curses carved into the walls. But Egypt's approach to secure storage was far more sophisticated than just hiding a dead king's belongings. The great temples along the Nile, at Karnak, Luxor, Abydos, and Edfu, all contained interior chambers that functioned as treasury rooms. The valuables held in them included gold, lapis lazuli, electrum alloys, ritual vessels, and enormous quantities of grain that represented real economic power. The Egyptians also understood something that modern vault designers would recognize immediately. The best security system is the one that nobody believes exists. Many of the most important storage chambers in Egyptian temples were built without obvious entrances. They were accessible only through passages disguised as ordinary wall sections, or through trapdoors concealed beneath stone flooring that would be invisible to anyone who did not already know where to look. The treasury room within the tomb of Tutankhamun, discovered by Howard Carter in 1922, offers one of the clearest surviving examples of how the Egyptians thought about secured storage. When Carter finally got the burial chamber open, he found an adjacent room crammed so densely with objects that it took years to properly document and remove them all. More than 5,000 individual items were cataloged in that small space. Among them were the pharaoh's canopic chest, containing his embalmed organs, a gilded shrine to the jackal-headed god Anubis, miniature boats intended for the pharaoh's journey through the afterlife, jewelry of a quality and intricacy that even modern craftsmen struggle to reproduce. All of it sealed behind a plastered wall that, from the outside, appeared to be nothing more than a continuation of the tomb's painted decorations. The whole chamber was hidden in plain sight, and it had stayed hidden for over 3,000 years. That discovery, and the global sensation it produced, sparked something that had been simmering in the collective imagination for decades. The idea that beneath the familiar surface of the world, behind walls that looked like walls, under floors that seemed solid, there were spaces full of extraordinary things. Things hidden deliberately, carefully, sometimes urgently. The idea was not wrong. Across the ancient world, similar discoveries have been made again and again. In 2026, archaeologists in Baden-Württemberg, Germany, announced findings from a Celtic burial chamber constructed around 585 BCE, approximately 2,600 years ago. The chamber was completely preserved, its wooden construction still intact, its walls still holding the shapes of objects that had once rested against them. Robbers had gotten there before the archaeologists, tunneling in from the southeast and removing whatever metal and precious objects they had been able to find. But the very fact of those robber tunnels speaks to something important. Someone, at some point in the distant past, knew enough about what was inside to think it worth the effort of digging through solid earth to reach it. The knowledge of what lay behind sealed doors had a way of passing down through generations, long after the people who had originally done the sealing were gone. In the Indus Valley Civilization, which flourished between roughly 2,500 and 1,900 BCE in what is now Pakistan and northwestern India, the cities of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa were built with sophisticated granary complexes that served as communal vaults. The elevated platforms on which these structures stood, their thick walls, their carefully managed access points, all speak to an organized understanding of what it meant to protect resources. Grain in that context was literally life. Control the grain and you controlled existence itself. The Romans brought an engineering precision to the concept of the vault that changed it permanently. The word vault itself has Latin roots from the word volta, which referred to a turned or arched structure. Roman construction technique was built around the arch. The barrel vault, a continuous arched ceiling running the length of a space, allowed Romans to build rooms that could support enormous weight above them. This was revolutionary. Suddenly you could put something heavy on top of a secured room, making it not just locked but structurally difficult to enter from above. You could bury it, essentially, while still accessing it from below. Roman temples held state treasuries. The aerarium, located in the Temple of Saturn in the Roman Forum, was the original repository of the Roman state's wealth. Silver and gold, military standards, important documents, all of it held in a building that was itself a sacred space, the dual function of the vault and the temple persisting across centuries and civilizations. And then there were the Roman hypocausts, the underfloor heating systems that required significant excavated space beneath buildings. It did not take long for people to realize that the same void that heated a floor could also, in modified form, conceal a storage space. Roman villas across what is now Britain, France, Spain, and Germany have been found with rooms that served no obvious domestic purpose, chambers tucked beneath floor level, accessible only through removable stone sections, clearly intended to hold something that needed not to be found. The archaeology of the ancient world is, in many ways, the archaeology of hiding. What strikes you when you spend time with this material is the continuity of it. The instinct runs deep, and it runs across every culture. The pharaoh in his valley tomb, the Sumerian priest in his sealed inner chamber, the Roman magistrate with his concealed floor cache, the Celtic chieftain buried beneath a mound with his chariot and his stolen bronze nails. All of them understood the same thing. That what you hold can be taken from you, that protection requires secrecy, that the most secure vault is the one no one knows exists. That understanding would keep shaping the human world for the next several thousand years. And the vaults that came after would grow more sophisticated, more desperate, and in many cases far stranger than anything the ancient world ever produced. If you're enjoying this journey, drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is there. And if this is the kind of thing you want to keep falling asleep to, hitting subscribe costs you nothing and it means everything to a small channel. Now, settle in. We are just getting started. Section 2. The Vault Builders of the Ancient World. Pyramids, Temples, and Hidden Rooms. The Giza Plateau, on the western edge of the Egyptian capital of Cairo, sits in a kind of visual relationship with time that you cannot really prepare yourself for. The Great Pyramid of Khufu, constructed around 2,560 BCE, rises 140 meters above the desert floor. That is 459 feet. At the time of its completion, it was the tallest man-made structure on the planet, and it held that distinction for roughly 3,800 years. Most people, when they think about the pyramids, think about them as tombs, and they are technically tombs. But they are also something else entirely. They are architectural arguments about permanence. They are the physical expression of a society's belief that the right container, built correctly, from the right materials, in the right configuration, could preserve what it held against time itself. The internal structure of the Great Pyramid is a complex arrangement of passages, chambers, and shafts that Egyptologists are still in the process of fully understanding. The king's chamber sits at the pyramid's heart, a room lined with polished red Aswan granite, its ceiling formed by 5 separate weight-relieving chambers designed to redirect the enormous pressure of the stone above it. The sarcophagus of Khufu was found inside, empty, either looted in antiquity or never containing his mummy in the first place, depending on which interpretation you find most persuasive. But the passages that lead to the king's chamber tell a different story than the one usually told about these structures. The ascending passage, which leads from the pyramid's original entrance toward the Grand Gallery, was sealed with 3 massive granite plugs that slid down from a cavity above, blocking access completely after the burial was completed. The workers who installed those plugs had to exit the pyramid through a shaft cut specifically for their escape, a corridor that bypasses the sealed section entirely. The pyramid was designed, from the beginning, not just as a burial place but as a vault, a space engineered to prevent re-entry. It almost worked, but almost is a complicated word when you are talking about 3,000 years. Beneath the main structure, a subterranean chamber cut into the bedrock beneath the pyramid remains largely unfinished and deeply mysterious. Its ceiling was never smoothed. Its floor was never leveled. A shaft drops from the Grand Gallery into this unfinished space. The exact purpose of the subterranean chamber has been debated by Egyptologists for generations. One influential theory holds that it was originally intended to be the burial chamber, but that plans changed during construction. Another suggests it served as a decoy, a false vault meant to draw would-be tomb robbers away from the actual chambers above. If that second interpretation is correct, then the Great Pyramid was not merely a vault. It was a vault with a deliberate decoy built into it. The ancient Egyptians were playing psychological games with future thieves 3,000 years before the combination lock was invented. The Scan Pyramids project, an ongoing international research effort that began in 2015, has used muon radiography to detect voids inside the Great Pyramid without drilling or excavating. Muon radiography works by detecting cosmic ray particles that pass through stone at different rates depending on density. In 2017, the project announced the discovery of a large void above the Grand Gallery, a space roughly 30 meters long that had previously been unknown. They named it the Scan Pyramids Big Void. What it contains or was intended to contain remains unknown. Access has not yet been achieved. The pyramid holds its secrets with patience. The Valley of the Kings, on the west bank of the Nile opposite Luxor, takes a completely different approach to the question of the vault. Where the pyramid is massive, visible from miles away, unmistakably significant, the tombs cut into the limestone cliffs of the valley are hidden, or they were meant to be. The entrance shafts were sealed, plastered over, and in many cases buried under rubble intentionally created to look like the natural accumulation of desert debris. The logic was that if no one could find the entrance, no one could rob what lay inside. It did not work as well as the theory suggested. By the end of the New Kingdom period, roughly 1069 BCE, essentially every royal tomb in the Valley of the Kings had been entered and stripped. The priests who oversaw the necropolis eventually collected the surviving mummies and hid them in 2 large caches, one of which, discovered in 1881, contained the mummified remains of more than 40 pharaohs and queens, including Ramesses the Great, Seti I, and Thutmose III. They had been gathered from their original tombs and reburied together in a communal hiding place, the last act of a civilization trying to protect what it most valued from a world that had become too dangerous to trust. Tutankhamun's tomb survived primarily because it was small, unimpressive by royal standards, and quickly buried under the debris from the construction of the later tomb of Ramesses VI directly above it. The rubble from the later excavation filled the entrance of Tutankhamun's tomb so completely that the valley workers who lived on site for generations built their huts directly over it without ever knowing it was there. The vault that works best is the one that disappears. Moving east, to what is now India, the concept of the sacred vault reached one of its most elaborate expressions in the temple complexes of the subcontinent. The Padmanabhaswamy Temple in Thiruvananthapuram, Kerala, is dedicated to the god Vishnu and has stood in some form on its current site for well over 1,000 years, though its current structure dates primarily to the 18th century. The temple is built above a series of underground chambers, and the scale of what those chambers contain became public knowledge only in 2011, when a Supreme Court-appointed committee began a survey of the temple's vaults for the first time. What they found has been described, by people who were present during the opening, as genuinely stunning. Vault A, the first chamber opened, contained an estimated 70,000 kilograms of gold, along with diamonds, rubies, emeralds, and antique jewelry dating back to periods spanning several centuries. Among the specific objects catalogued were a solid gold throne, a pure gold coconut shell studded with rubies and emeralds, a golden scepter several feet long, and numerous ancient coins from different eras including Roman and Dutch colonial currency. The estimated value of the contents of that single vault was placed at approximately $22 billion, making it one of the largest collections of treasure ever documented in a single location. There are 6 vaults beneath the temple. Only 5 have been opened. The 6th, called Vault B, remains sealed. The chamber's massive wooden doors are reinforced with metal, and according to both local tradition and some structural assessments, there is no conventional mechanism visible for opening them. Local belief holds that the chamber should not be opened because it was sealed by sacred ritual rather than physical lock, and that attempting to force it open would bring catastrophic harm. The legal and political debates around Vault B have been ongoing since 2011. The Supreme Court of India has been involved. Religious authorities have been consulted. Archaeologists have expressed concern. The chamber remains sealed. Somewhere in the world, right now, there is a room beneath a temple whose doors have not been opened for centuries, and no one alive knows exactly what is inside. The temple at Dendera in Upper Egypt contains a similar enigma in its basement. The hypostyle hall of the temple, built during the Ptolemaic period between 54 and 20 BCE, sits above a series of crypts that run beneath the floor of the structure. These underground chambers, accessible through concealed stairways hidden behind movable blocks in the floor, contain reliefs carved into the walls. Some of those reliefs have become the subject of intense and sometimes extraordinary speculation because of their unusual style and content, which some observers have described as resembling technological objects. The mainstream archaeological interpretation is that they represent religious scenes in a stylized artistic idiom specific to the late Ptolemaic period. Whatever they depict, the fact of their location, in sealed underground chambers beneath a temple floor, accessible only through hidden doors, is not in dispute. The ancient world built its vaults at every scale and in every culture. The Celtic chieftains of northern Europe buried their most valued objects in earthen mounds, sometimes alone, sometimes with the dead, sometimes with elaborate assemblages of objects that suggest complex ritual thinking about what needed to be preserved and why. The Scythians of the Pontic steppe buried their kings in kurgans, vast earthen tumuli, along with horses, weapons, gold ornaments, and sometimes servants, sealing the entire complex beneath a monument that could be seen across the flat grassland from miles away. The Viking chieftains of Scandinavia buried ships. Ships were the highest technology of their age, and the decision to put one underground, intact, along with its contents, suggests a vault logic. You were sealing the best thing you had against whatever came next. What comes next is always the question behind a vault. In every culture, at every historical period, the decision to build a vault is a decision made in the shadow of uncertainty. You build a vault because you believe that what you have is worth protecting, and because you believe that the world around you is not safe enough to leave it unprotected. The vault is an act of imagination about the future. It says, I do not know what is coming, but I know that what I have is too important to lose to it. The extraordinary thing is how often that instinct was right, and how often the vaults outlasted the civilizations that built them by thousands of years. The treasure of Tutankhamun sat sealed for more than 33 centuries. The contents of the Padmanabhaswamy temple sat largely unexamined for at least several hundred years. The Celtic burial chamber in Baden-Württemberg was constructed in 585 BCE and sat undiscovered, its timber still intact, until modern archaeologists stumbled across it. The vault builders were not wrong to trust stone and earth with their secrets. Stone and earth kept them for far longer than any human institution could have managed. Section 3. The long shadow of the church crypts, relics, and sealed rooms. In the year 326 CE, the Roman Emperor Constantine I ordered the demolition of a pagan temple on the Mons Vaticanus, a hill on the western bank of the Tiber in the city of Rome. Beneath the demolished temple, workers uncovered a sprawling necropolis, a city of the dead stretching back several centuries. Constantine had it filled in, the graves covered over with thousands of tons of earth and rubble, and on top of the filled necropolis he ordered the construction of the first St. Peter's Basilica. The reason was not random. Constantine's architects believed, based on the existing tradition of the early Christian community in Rome, that the Apostle Peter had been martyred in Nero's circus on that same hill and buried very close to that spot. The basilica, in other words, was built specifically to vault the most sacred relic the young Christian church possessed: a body, a grave, a point of contact with divinity. That decision shaped the next 1700 years of architectural thinking in the Western world. The church crypt, which developed out of the need to place a burial chamber in a location of spiritual significance, while also keeping it accessible to pilgrims who wanted to venerate the relics within, became one of the defining architectural forms of medieval Europe. By the 8th century, crypts were standard features of major churches across the continent. The typical arrangement involved a corridor running beneath the main altar, accessible from stairs at either side of the choir, that allowed pilgrims to pass close to the tomb or relic chamber while the services above continued undisturbed. But the crypt was always more than just a place for relics. It was also a vault in the most literal sense, a secured underground chamber where the most valuable possessions of a religious community could be stored: gold plate, jeweled reliquaries, illuminated manuscripts, sealed correspondence, documents of land ownership, papal bulls, the deeds and debts that constituted the political and economic reality of medieval Europe. The monasteries were the banks of the medieval world. The crypts were their vaults. What made the monastic vault particularly secure was the combination of spiritual and physical deterrent. A thief who broke into a vault at a monastery was not merely committing robbery, he was committing sacrilege. The objects inside were consecrated, connected to divine authority. The punishment, both in this world and the next, was understood to be severe, and yet the crypts were still robbed. History is full of examples. Viking raids on coastal monasteries in Britain and Ireland specifically targeted the churches first, because that was where the gold was. The monastery at Lindisfarne, attacked in 793 CE, in what is often cited as the event that opened the Viking age of raiding in Britain, was stripped of its sacred objects, the monks killed or enslaved, the crypt emptied. The response was to hide things more deeply, to build false walls, to develop underground passages that only certain members of the community would know about. Canterbury Cathedral, one of the most important religious sites in England, sits in the center of an extraordinarily layered history of concealment and discovery. In early 2026, workers undertaking a routine renovation of a city center square near the cathedral lifted paving stones and found a previously unknown brick-lined chamber beneath them. The square sits on the footprint of a former church site, and the vault below it speaks to the centuries of building, demolition, rebuilding, and burial that characterize urban sites with continuous occupation. This is not unusual in European cities with long histories. Walk the streets of Rome, London, Paris, or Vilnius, and the ground beneath you is a complex stratigraphy of crypts, passages, filled-in chambers, and forgotten vaults that successive generations built over and forgot about. The city you see is only the most recent layer. Vilnius Cathedral in Lithuania provides one of the more vivid recent examples of this dynamic. In late 2024, researchers using an endoscopic camera to examine cracks in the walls of the cathedral's crypt discovered a hiding place that had not been opened since 1939. Inside were royal regalia, crowns, jewels, and a scepter belonging to Lithuanian and Polish monarchs from the 15th and 16th centuries. The objects had been hidden there at the outbreak of the Second World War by clergy who understood, correctly, that the approaching conflict would threaten them. Wrapped in newspaper dated 1939 and tucked into a cavity beneath a staircase in the crypt, they stayed undisturbed for 85 years. The regalia were described by Lithuanian officials as priceless historical treasures, symbols of statehood and identity. They had been there the entire time. Beneath a cathedral that remained in active use throughout the Soviet occupation, throughout decades of state-sponsored atheism, through the collapse of the Soviet Union and the re-establishment of Lithuanian independence, through all of it, a cavity in a stone wall held crowns from the 15th century, waiting. The story of what medieval churches and monasteries chose to put behind sealed doors is, in many cases, a story about what those institutions knew was valuable beyond their own survival. Relics occupied a position in medieval religious life that is difficult to fully appreciate from the vantage point of the modern secular world. The physical remains of saints, or objects that had come into contact with the sacred, were understood to be conduits of divine power. They could heal, they could protect, they could intercede with God on behalf of the living and the dead. A town or church that possessed an important relic possessed an advantage that was simultaneously spiritual and economic, because pilgrims came to venerate relics, and pilgrims spent money. The reliquary, the container designed to hold and display a relic, became one of the great art forms of the medieval period. Craftsmen created objects of extraordinary beauty, golden containers shaped like hands, feet, heads, or small churches, decorated with enamel, jewels, and delicate metalwork, designed to communicate the significance of what was held inside. The most important relics were sealed behind these containers with wax or lead, inaccessible to ordinary handling, only opened on the most significant feast days. And then there were the relics that were held in absolute secrecy, whose existence was known only to the senior members of a religious community, whose location was never written down, whose containers were kept in the most secure and least accessible parts of a church's underground system. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, built over the site traditionally identified as the location of Christ's crucifixion, burial, and resurrection, contains layers of subterranean structure that archaeology has only partially mapped. The building has been destroyed and rebuilt multiple times over its roughly 1,700 years of history, and each reconstruction has buried or altered elements of what came before. There are sections of the church's foundations that remain completely unexplored, either because access is physically difficult, or because the competing claims of the various Christian denominations who share custody of the building make any excavation politically impossible. The situation at the Holy Sepulchre is in some ways a miniature model of a much larger problem. Religious authority and physical possession combined create a kind of impenetrability that pure physical security cannot achieve. The vaults that are hardest to open are not always the ones with the most sophisticated locks. Sometimes they are the ones guarded by centuries of accumulated tradition, by competing layers of authority, by the sheer weight of institutional continuity. The crypt of Winchester Cathedral in England floods regularly during wet winters, filling with water that reaches knee-height in parts. This is because the cathedral is built on waterlogged ground at the edge of the River Itchen, and the water table rises seasonally. The stones of the crypt, some dating to the 11th century, are periodically submerged, and yet the crypt has been in continuous use since its construction. It holds the remains of Saxon kings. It preserves evidence of the earliest phases of the cathedral's construction. It is one of the oldest surviving cathedral crypts in England, and it spends a significant part of every year partially underwater. The monks who built it knew the ground was wet. They built it there anyway. Some things are worth more than dry storage. Canterbury Cathedral contains beneath its Norman choir one of the most dramatic crypt spaces in all of medieval England. A forest of stone columns supporting the floor above, the capitals carved with fantastic animals and figures that watch you from every direction as you move through the space. The crypt at Canterbury was purpose-built to hold the remains of St. Thomas Becket after his murder in the cathedral in 1170. Pilgrims came from across Europe to venerate Becket's tomb, and the crypt was designed as a kind of spiritual experience in architecture, the stone columns creating a labyrinthine quality, the darkness and the low vaulted ceiling creating a sense of compression and depth that heightened the emotional experience of proximity to the sacred. Becket's bones were eventually moved from the crypt to a new shrine in the Trinity Chapel above, where they stayed until 1538 when Henry VIII ordered the shrine destroyed and the saint's remains dispersed. What exactly happened to Becket's bones after that moment is not fully known. Some accounts suggest they were burned. Others suggest they were secretly preserved by the monks who served the cathedral. Periodic searches of the crypt and the areas beneath the cathedral floor have turned up various remains that have been proposed as Becket's, none conclusively identified. A saint's bones, hidden somewhere beneath an English cathedral, potentially for nearly 500 years. The medieval church built its vaults everywhere it went. In the newly converted territories of northern and eastern Europe, the first solid structures built in every new settlement were the churches, and the first structural feature below the main floor was the crypt. Knowledge of these spaces often died with the communities that built them. Wars, fires, plagues, the simple passage of time. All of these things erased the memory of what lay beneath the ground. Modern urban construction regularly encounters these forgotten spaces. Builders digging foundations in London, Paris, Cologne, and dozens of other European cities cut through the remains of medieval crypts without any prior knowledge of their existence. Sometimes what is found prompts a halt to construction and an archaeological excavation. Sometimes it is simply built over, sealed again beneath reinforced concrete, its contents undisturbed. The church built things to last. Some of what it built has lasted so well that we have not finished finding it yet. Section 4. Royal Treasuries and the Secrets of Crowns. In the summer of 1671, a man named Thomas Blood walked into the Tower of London with a plan that, by any standard of audacity, has rarely been equaled. Blood was a soldier of fortune, an Anglo-Irish adventurer with a complicated history of political intrigue, who had by this point become something of a celebrity in the murky world of Restoration England. He was also, on this particular morning, disguised as a clergyman. He had spent weeks cultivating a relationship with Talbot Edwards, the elderly keeper of the crown jewels of England, telling him his fictional niece had fallen in love with Edwards's own nephew. He had arranged a meeting between the two young people under the pretense of an introduction. On the morning of the actual attempt, Blood arrived early, accompanied by 3 associates. He asked to see the crown jewels while they waited for the rest of the party. Edwards obliged, opening the vault beneath the Martin Tower. And then Blood knocked the old man over the head with a wooden mallet. His accomplices tied and gagged Edwards's wife, and they began the process of taking the crown jewels of England. What happened next is one of history's more remarkable stories. Blood flattened St. Edward's crown with the mallet to make it easier to conceal beneath his cloak. One of his accomplices tried to file the scepter with the cross in half to make it fit down his trousers. Another stuffed the orb down his breeches. They almost made it. Edwards's son returned unexpectedly from military service that morning, discovered his bound father, raised the alarm, and Blood and his accomplices were captured after a chase through the tower grounds. The jewels were recovered, battered but largely intact. What followed was the strangest part of an already strange story. King Charles II refused to have Blood executed, despite the massive public demand for his punishment. He granted him an audience instead, by some accounts found him amusing, and ultimately gave him a pension and an estate in Ireland. Blood lived until 1680, apparently in relative comfort, an outcome that led to significant speculation about whether the attempted theft of the crown jewels had been authorized in some way by the king himself, possibly as part of an insurance fraud scheme or a political maneuver. The truth of those suspicions was never established. The crown jewels themselves survived, slightly worse for wear, to continue their existence as perhaps the most physically secured collection of royal objects in the world. Today they are stored in the Jewel House within the Tower of London, behind bullet-resistant glass, under 24-hour guard, in a building that has served continuously as a royal fortress and treasury for nearly 1,000 years. But the tower is only one node in a much broader history of royal vaulting, a history that reaches back centuries before Blood and extends far beyond England. The earliest royal treasuries were not fixed installations. They were movable, carried with the monarch wherever the royal court traveled. This is partly why so much ancient royal treasure has been lost. Courts moved. Campaigns were fought. Kings died in battle far from home, and the treasure they traveled with was seized, scattered, hidden in haste, or simply disappeared in the chaos of defeat. The transition from movable treasury to fixed vault is one of the markers of a maturing state. When a royal dynasty was secure enough in a fixed capital to trust that its wealth would be safe in one location, it could begin to invest in permanent infrastructure designed specifically for storage and security. The Tower of London represents that transition in English history. The Louvre in France, the the Hofburg in Vienna, the various iterations of the Russian imperial treasury in Moscow, and St. Petersburg. These were not just buildings where monarchs lived. They were vaults that happened to have living quarters attached. The Habsburg dynasty, which ruled the Holy Roman Empire, and then the Austro-Hungarian Empire for nearly 700 years, accumulated objects of extraordinary value and significance over that time. The imperial treasury in Vienna, housed in a wing of the Hofburg Palace, contains objects that span the full sweep of European history. Among them is the imperial crown of the Holy Roman Empire, created for Otto the Great around 962 CE and worn at the coronations of German Roman emperors for over 800 years. There is also the Spear of Longinus, also known as the Holy Lance, an object venerated since at least the 9th century as the spear that pierced the side of Christ at the crucifixion. The Holy Lance's history is worth dwelling on for a moment. The relic was held by successive German emperors as an emblem of divine right and military power. In 1424, Emperor Sigismund ordered it transferred from one secure location to another, from the imperial castle in Nuremberg to the treasury in Vienna, for permanent safekeeping. It traveled there with a formal escort and was locked away with a solemnity that makes clear how seriously the object was taken as a genuine relic of the Passion. In 1938, when Germany annexed Austria, Hitler ordered the Holy Lance and several other items from the Habsburg collection transferred to Nuremberg, apparently because of his obsessive belief in the power of such relics. The objects remained in Nuremberg in an underground vault beneath the city until April 1945, when they were seized by advancing American forces and eventually returned to Vienna. There is a persistent and enduring story that Hitler's interest in the Holy Lance stemmed from a visit to the Vienna treasury as a young man, when he stood before the relic and felt a profound connection to it. This story was promoted enthusiastically by some later authors as the foundation of a whole mystical narrative about the Nazi regime, and it has been heavily disputed by historians as almost certainly mythologized or invented. The relic's documented history is remarkable enough, without mystical embellishment. It is an object that was venerated as sacred by European monarchs for more than 1,000 years, held in locked vaults for most of that period, shuffled between imperial capitals across 2 world wars, and is currently on display in a glass case in Vienna. The treasure rooms of the Russian czars were, if anything, even more extravagant than their Western European equivalents. The Kremlin Armory in Moscow holds a collection of state regalia and royal objects dating from the 12th century onward. The Moscow Kremlin itself, that complex of walls, towers, cathedrals, and palaces rising above the Moskva River, is essentially a single enormous vault. Its walls are 18 to 21 feet thick in some sections. Its towers were originally designed as watchtowers with firing positions. The gates could be sealed and the entire complex defended against assault. Within those walls, the Tsars accumulated extraordinary wealth. The Orlov diamond, one of the largest cut diamonds in the world, acquired by Catherine the Great in 1774, sits in the Diamond Fund, the Russian equivalent of the Crown Jewels collection. The Shah diamond, A8, 8-carat stone with inscriptions from 3 different Persian rulers carved into its surface, was given to Russia in 1829 as partial compensation for the assassination of the Russian ambassador in Tehran. It carries a history, engraved literally into its surface, of 3 centuries of Persian imperial power. The Romanov dynasty's relationship with its own vault would end catastrophically. When the revolutionary government seized power in 1917 and the Tsar's family was arrested, the contents of the imperial treasuries became a subject of immediate and intense interest. Much of the collection was eventually nationalized and is now held in Russian state museums, but a significant quantity of jewelry and valuables that had been the personal property of the imperial family was never fully accounted for. Rings, bracelets, necklaces, individual diamonds removed from their settings and sold in pieces to destroy the evidence of their origin. The dispersal of Romanov jewelry through European and American markets in the 1920s and 1930s was conducted with deliberate obscurity. The specific story of what happened to the larger pieces, the great tiaras and parers worn by the tsarinas at state functions, is only partially known. Some were sold openly. Some were acquired by foreign royal families. Some, according to documented historical research, were disassembled, the stones removed and recut to make them unrecognizable. before being sold to jewelers in London, Paris, and New York. There are diamonds sitting in modern jewelry shops or on the wrists of wealthy people who acquired them through completely legitimate subsequent transactions that began their existence in the Russian imperial treasury, permanently disconnected from their history, their original identity erased as surely as if the vault that held them had never existed. The Scottish crown jewels offer a different kind of vault story, one about institutional memory and its limits. The Honours of Scotland, comprising the crown, the sceptre, and the sword of state, are the oldest surviving set of royal regalia in the British Isles. Following the Act of Union in 1707, which merged the English and Scottish parliaments, the honours were locked in an oak chest in a room in Edinburgh Castle and simply left there, not sealed with great ceremony, not declared lost, just locked away and, over the following decades, largely forgotten. In 1818, the novelist Sir Walter Scott petitioned to have the room opened and the chest examined. He organized a party that included the future King George IV. When they opened the sealed room and lifted the lid of the oak chest, the honours of Scotland were inside, exactly as they had been placed more than a century earlier. The crown, the sceptre, the sword of state, untouched, perfectly preserved, hidden in plain sight in a locked room in a castle that had been continuously occupied and defended throughout their absence by people who had simply stopped remembering to look. The vault had done exactly what it was designed to do. It had kept what was placed inside it for over 100 years, waiting. Section 5. The Vatican's Locked Rooms, Archives, Catacombs, and Hidden Depths. Beneath St. Peter's Square in Rome, 50 feet below the travertine paving stones that millions of tourists walk across every year, there is a necropolis. This is not a metaphor. There is an actual city of the dead beneath the most visited public space in Vatican City, a complex of mausoleums and graves that dates to the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, constructed during the reign of the Roman emperors on what was then the outer edge of the city of Rome. Wealthy Roman families built elaborate tomb structures here, above ground by the standards of the time, decorated with mosaics, painted plaster, marble reliefs, and inscriptions. They were ordinary tombs of the prosperous Roman middle class, nothing royal or imperial, just the domestic architecture of death. When Constantine ordered the construction of the first St. Peter's Basilica in 326 CE, the necropolis was systematically buried under tons of fill soil. The graves were not destroyed. They were simply covered, subsumed, sealed beneath a growing depth of earth that eventually became the foundation of one of the most significant buildings in Christian history. The necropolis was rediscovered in the 1940s during excavations ordered by Pope Pius XII beneath the floor of the current St. Peter's Basilica, which was itself built in the 16th and 17th centuries on the same site as Constantine's original structure. Workers digging drainage channels cut through the roofs of the ancient mausolea and found themselves looking down into Roman tomb chambers that had been sealed for 1,600 years. The colors of the painted walls were still vivid in the beam of a flashlight. In the middle of the necropolis, beneath the main altar of the current basilica, the excavators found evidence of a grave that had been venerated and marked since at least the 2nd century CE, a simple earthen burial surrounded by a structure that later generations had progressively elaborated. A small shrine, then a larger one, then the entire basilica above. Whether the remains found there truly belong to the Apostle Peter is a question that cannot be definitively answered from physical evidence alone. The Church holds that they do. The excavation found bones, predominantly male, elderly, wrapped in what had been expensive purple-dyed cloth, in a location that matches the ancient accounts of Peter's burial. The bones were subsequently examined, tested, and placed in a container that was then inserted back into the niche beneath the altar. The Vatican sealed the question along with the bones. The relationship between the Vatican and its secrets is one of the most persistently fascinating subjects in modern historical imagination. Much of the fascination comes from a single architectural fact. The Vatican is an independent sovereign state, governed by an institution that has been continuously operating for roughly 1,700 years, that has accumulated documents, objects, and knowledge across that entire period, and that controls access to almost all of it. The Vatican Apostolic Archive, known for centuries as the Vatican Secret Archive, runs for approximately 53 miles of shelving space. Let that settle for a moment. If you laid every shelf end to end, you would have something approaching the length of a marathon course. In those shelves are documents dating from the 8th century CE to the present day, the accumulated correspondence, administrative records, diplomatic communications, and private papers of the papacy across its entire modern history. The word secret in the Old Latin name, Archivum Secretum Apostolicum Vaticanum, did not mean hidden in the way we currently use the word. The Latin secretum meant something closer to private or personal, the Pope's own archive rather than any public record. Pope Francis changed the official name in 2019 to remove the misleading implication. The new name, Vatican Apostolic Archive, is more accurate, though perhaps less atmospheric. But here is the thing. The name change does not address the more precise and complicated sense in which parts of the archive genuinely are secret in the modern understanding of the word. Materials relating to periods after 1958 are actively withheld from outside researchers. Private records of church figures after 1922 are restricted. The practical policy is that the archive operates on a 75-year rule, with access granted to documents from pontificates that ended at least that long ago. There are sections of the archive where photography is strictly prohibited. There are rooms that scholars are not permitted to enter. In 2005, Sergio Pagano, the longtime prefect of the archive, gave a candid interview in which he described the archival holdings as so vast that the challenge was not secrecy but processing. The resources required to catalog, preserve, and make accessible 53 miles of historical documents exceeded what the Vatican could practically deploy. This is a mundane explanation for an institution that generates anything but mundane speculation, but it has the ring of truth. Most of the archive's secrets are secrets not because they are being hidden, but because there are more documents than there are people to read them. That said, some specific secrets held in the archive have been genuinely significant when they emerged into public knowledge. The Chinon parchment, a document measuring roughly 60 feet in length, contains the minutes of the trials of the Knights Templar conducted between 1307 and 1312. The document had been misfiled in the archive for centuries, placed in the wrong box after Napoleon's forces returned the seized Vatican records from Paris in the early 19th century. Its existence was known from historical records, but its physical location within the archive was lost. It was only found in 2001, when an archivist searching for a different document opened a box and found it inside. What the Chinon parchment revealed, when it was finally examined and published in 2007, was that Pope Clement V had actually absolved the Knights Templar of heresy in 1308 in a private hearing conducted at the castle of Chinon. The absolution had been concealed, the official papal position in public proceeding being one of condemnation, while the private reality was more nuanced. The Grand Master of the Templars, Jacques de Molay, was burned at the stake in Paris in 1314 as a convicted heretic. He died as an officially condemned man, while a sealed document 600 years old recorded that the Pope had actually found him innocent. A document misfiled in a box in a climate-controlled room in Vatican City held one of the most consequential corrections to medieval history imaginable, waiting quietly for someone to open the right box. The Vatican's physical underground is as layered as its documentary holdings. The papal necropolis beneath St. Peter's Basilica is open to small groups of visitors by appointment, a tour that must be booked months in advance, and that takes perhaps 45 people at a time through the excavated streets of the Roman tomb complex beneath the basilica floor. Standing there, in a Roman mausoleum from the 2nd century CE, looking up at a ceiling that is actually the underside of the floor of one of the most visited buildings on Earth, is one of those experiences that resists easy description. Below the necropolis, there are levels that visitors are not shown. The Vatican sits on volcanic rock, and the geological history of the area includes cavities, passages, and formations in the tuff that predate any human construction. The precise extent of the accessible space beneath the Vatican complex is not publicly documented. The relationship between the Vatican and Nazi Germany, and specifically the question of what documentation the archive holds about Pope Pius XII's responses during the Holocaust, was a subject of such historical and moral urgency that Pope Francis announced in 2019 that the Pius XII materials would be open to scholars. The archive was opened in March 2020, closed almost immediately because of the pandemic, and then gradually made accessible as public health conditions allowed. What scholars found was significant and painful. Research by Nina Valbusque and others discovered Vatican correspondence from the post-war period that revealed, as she described it, a deep lack of understanding among some Vatican officials of what had happened during the Holocaust, alongside expressions of anti-Semitic sentiment. The picture that emerged was not one of simple villainy, but of institutional failure at a profound moment in human history. Failures of understanding, of courage, and of moral clarity in the face of unprecedented atrocity. The archive held the evidence. It had held it for 70 years. When the doors were finally opened, scholars found what the institution had presumably always known was there. There is also a tunnel. Running beneath the Borgo district of Rome, connecting the Vatican to the Castel Sant'Angelo on the west bank of the Tiber, is a fortified passage called the Passetto di Borgo, originally constructed in the 13th century and expanded several times thereafter. The Castel Sant'Angelo is itself a vault in its origins, having been built as the mausoleum of the Emperor Hadrian in the 2nd century CE before being converted into a fortress and then into a papal refuge. The connection between the two structures via the underground passage allowed popes in danger to move between them unseen. Pope Clement VII used the passage in 1527, escaping through it while the forces of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V sacked Rome. He remained in the Castel Sant'Angelo for several months, literally locked inside a fortified vault, while the city outside burned. The Vatican has been, throughout its history, both a keeper of secrets and a refuge from the world. The vaults beneath it, the tunnels running from it, the archives sealed within it, all of these speak to an institution that has spent nearly 2 millennia learning to protect what it holds against time, conflict, and the curiosity of the outside world. Some of that protection has served scholarship and history. Some of it has served concealment. The two purposes have not always been easy to disentangle. Section 6. The Age of Steel Bank Vaults, Combination Locks, and the Architecture of Trust. The first bank vault in the recognizable modern sense, a purpose-built steel reinforced room designed specifically to resist both physical assault and fire, appeared in the mid-19th century as a response to specific historical circumstances. Before the industrial age, bank security was essentially a matter of architecture and personnel. Strong rooms, lined with stone or brick, secured by heavy iron doors and patrolled by guards, were the standard approach. They were vulnerable to determined attack, to corruption of the guards, to fire, and to the structural limitations of pre-industrial construction. The bankers of the early modern period lost money regularly to all of these vulnerabilities. The Industrial Revolution changed everything. Steel could now be produced in large quantities and formed into plates of great thickness. New alloys were being developed that combined hardness with resistance to the cutting and drilling tools of the time. Clockmakers and mechanics were applying precision engineering to the design of locks, producing mechanisms of increasing sophistication. And the growing complexity of industrial capitalism meant that banks were accumulating assets on a scale that made investment in serious security not just prudent but essential. The result was the Victorian bank vault, an architectural form that would define the idea of secure storage for the next century and a half. Thomas Milner, an English locksmith who became one of the most significant figures in the history of vault design, published a treatise in 1825 that cataloged the various methods being used to break into contemporary safes and strong rooms. His documentation was remarkably detailed, describing the specific techniques being employed by professional burglars and suggesting countermeasures for each. It reads, "From the distance of 2 centuries, like a technical manual written from both sides of the door simultaneously." Milner understood the vault from the perspective of the person trying to build it and from the perspective of the person trying to enter it against the owner's wishes, and he understood that neither perspective was sufficient without the other. The mid-19th century saw a rapid escalation in vault design on both sides of the Atlantic. In the United States, the expansion of banking infrastructure to service the rapidly industrializing economy created a massive demand for secure storage. The companies that developed new vault technology, names like Diebold, Mosler, and Yale, became major industrial concerns. The vault door became, in a sense, a product that its makers marketed partly on the basis of the dramatic narratives of its inviolability. One of the most significant developments in this period was the time lock. Introduced commercially in the 1870s, the time lock was a clockwork mechanism integrated into the vault's locking system that prevented the door from being opened, regardless of whether you had the correct combination, until a preset time had elapsed. A bank that closed at 6 in the evening could set the time lock so that the vault would not open before 7 the following morning, making it impossible to coerce a bank employee into opening the vault outside of business hours. Since no amount of physical pressure could override a mechanism running on clockwork, the time lock addressed what had always been the weakest point in any vault system: the human being who knew how to open it. Bank robbers understood this weakness well before the time lock was invented, and some of the most notable robberies of the 19th century exploited it with brutal efficiency. The approach of taking bank staff hostage and forcing them to open vaults was common enough to have driven significant investment in security design. The time lock was one solution. Another was the development of vault systems requiring multiple people to open them, with different components of the combination known only to different employees, so that no single individual could be compelled to give complete access. By the early 20th century, major bank vaults had become engineering achievements that competed with each other for the superlative of impenetrability. The vault at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, built in 1924, sits 80 feet below street level, accessible only via elevator, sunk into the bedrock of Manhattan Island. Its door weighs 900 tons. The vault itself is essentially a 3-story steel cylinder set inside a 4-story steel and concrete structure. It holds gold bullion deposited by foreign governments and international financial institutions. At various points, it has held more gold in a single location than anywhere else on Earth, because the stability and neutrality of New York made it the preferred storage location for the reserves of dozens of countries. The gold is arranged on shelves in a series of compartments, each requiring separate authorization to access. At the peak of its holdings, the vault was estimated to contain approximately 25% of the world's known above-ground gold, roughly 6,000 tons. Most of it does not belong to the United States. Fort Knox, the United States Bullion Depository in Kentucky, opened its doors in January 1937, having been constructed the previous year at a cost of $560,000. The building measures 105 by 121 feet on its footprint and rises 42 feet above ground. That description makes it sound modest. The vault inside is anything but. The vault door is more than 20 tons of steel, assembled from several different types of steel alloy to resist different attack methods. It is set on a 100-hour time lock. Access requires multiple combinations, each held by a different person. No single individual holds all the codes. The building itself is constructed of 16,000 cubic feet of granite, 4,200 cubic yards of concrete, 750 tons of reinforced steel, and 670 tons of structural steel. Between the outer walls and the surrounding perimeter, there are successive rings of security, including minefields and razor wire. No one has ever attempted a robbery at Fort Knox. The very idea is treated in the security community as so self-evidently impossible that it has existed largely in the realm of fiction, most famously the 1964 James Bond film Goldfinger, in which the villain's plan is to detonate a nuclear device inside the vault to irradiate the gold and cause global economic collapse. As a heist plan, it has the virtue of acknowledging that physical entry to the vault is not achievable. Even in the imagination of the 1960s, Fort Knox was considered beyond robbery. But what Fort Knox actually contains has itself been a subject of controversy. The vault holds an estimated 147.3 million troy ounces of gold, roughly 4,580 tons, representing approximately 56% of the United States' total gold reserves. The last significant independent verification of these holdings occurred in 1974, when a congressional delegation and a group of journalists were permitted to enter the vault for the purpose of debunking rumors that the gold had been removed. The New York Times reporter who was present described the experience in terms that convey the visceral reality of standing in proximity to an almost incomprehensible quantity of gold. Bars stacked from floor to ceiling, 8 feet to the vault ceiling, in a room 6 feet wide and 12 feet deep. 36,236 bars in that single compartment, worth at 1,974 values, roughly $1.7 billion. and that was one of dozens of compartments. Since 1974, only 3 verifications have occurred. In 2017, Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin visited and tweeted that the gold was there. That tweet is not generally considered a rigorous audit. The question of whether Fort Knox holds exactly what the United States government says it holds remains genuinely unresolved. Most experts believe it does. The logistics of secretly removing the gold and the number of people who would have needed to be involved and subsequently silenced make deliberate fraud almost certainly impossible. But the opacity of the institution, the absence of regular independent auditing, and the near total restriction on access have kept the question alive. In 2025, both former President Donald Trump and Elon Musk publicly suggested opening the vault for a live-streamed inspection, a proposal that generated significant media coverage without producing any immediate policy change. The vault that is too secure to audit is, in some sense, too secure to fully trust. The Bank of England vault in London, set beneath Threadneedle Street in the City of London, holds more than 4,600 tons of gold, the second largest concentration of gold in the world after the Federal Reserve in New York. The vault is accessible via 3-foot-long keys of a design used for no other lock on Earth, combined with voice recognition and security measures whose specifics are not published. The walls are bomb-proof, a fact that was tested incidentally during the Second World War when the vault served as a shelter for bank staff during the Blitz. They sat inside a sealed steel and concrete chamber while bombs fell on the city around them, and the vault held. Gold needs very little maintenance. It does not rust, corrode, or decay. A gold bar stored in a vault in 1936 looks identical to a gold bar stored today. This is one of the reasons why the vaults that hold gold are, paradoxically, among the least disturbed spaces in the modern world. The gold goes in, the door closes, and the primary activity from that point forward is preventing anything from coming out. Section 7. The War Vault's hidden bunkers, buried gold, and the secrets of conflict. The small village of Merkers in the Thuringia region of Germany is not the kind of place that appears in many history books. It sits in the Werra-Meißner district, a quiet agricultural area in what was, before 1990, the western edge of East Germany. It has a modest church, a few hundred residents, and a network of underground passages that, in the spring of 1945, held the financial soul of the collapsing Third Reich. The Kaiserroda salt mine complex near Merkers had been used for industrial purposes for decades before the war. Salt mines have natural properties that make them ideal for storage: stable temperature, low humidity, darkness, and the inherent structural strength of the salt deposits themselves, which resist water infiltration and provide a chemically inert environment. German archivists and cultural officials had begun using mine complexes across the country as emergency storage for irreplaceable cultural objects from the late 1930s onward, as Allied bombing began to threaten the great museum collections of Berlin, Dresden, and other cities. What was moved to Merkers was something different in scale and character from ordinary cultural preservation. In February 1945, as the Soviet army advanced toward Berlin from the east, the Reichsbank began transferring its gold reserves to the Kaiserroda mine complex. The transport involved convoys of trucks under military escort, operating at night where possible, moving gold bullion, foreign currency, and a collection of objects that included personal valuables confiscated from concentration camp victims, known internally as the Melmer account after the SS officer who had overseen the confiscation and deposit process. The scale of what was moved to Merkers was staggering, even by the distorted accounting of a war economy. More than 400 million Reichsmarks worth of gold, almost 100 million French francs, bags of American dollars, British pounds, Norwegian crowns, and other European currencies. And then the art. Thousands of crates containing works from the Berlin State Museums, including paintings by Titian, Raphael, Rubens, and Rembrandt, along with the famous painted limestone bust of Nefertiti, removed from her case in the Egyptian Museum and shipped by covered truck through the burning remnants of the German capital. All of it went 2,100 feet below the surface of the earth, through the main shaft of the Kaiserroda mine, into a sealed vault within what was called Room Number 8. The Americans reached Merkers on the 6th of April, 1945. The discovery was made by accident. Two displaced persons, a pair of German midwives who had been walking outside after curfew for reasons that were never clearly established, were stopped by a patrol from the 90th Infantry Division. In the conversation that followed, they mentioned, almost casually, that the mine contained a significant amount of gold. The soldiers reported it up their chain of command. By the following morning, there were reinforced rifle companies guarding every entrance to the mine complex, and American engineers were preparing to blast through the vault door inside room number 8. When the masonry was breached, the room on the other side was 23 meters wide and 46 meters deep. Lieutenant Colonel Bernard Bernstein, who led the American financial investigation that followed, described what he found in terms that kept appearing in subsequent reports: extraordinary, unprecedented, beyond anything anticipated. Bags of gold bars, bags of Reichsmarks, numbering in the hundreds of millions, currency from across Europe, and in a separate section, the crates of art, stacked carefully under conditions that had preserved them remarkably well during the weeks of their underground storage. General Dwight Eisenhower visited the mine personally, and photographs taken during his visit show him standing in the vault beside Generals George Patton and Omar Bradley, the men around them dwarfed by stacks of gold bars and currency bags extending into the background. When General Patton descended into the mine and saw what had been found, he reportedly described the experience in his characteristic unfiltered style, expressing a kind of awe at the scale of the accumulated crime represented by what was in front of him. Much of the gold, particularly the material from the Melmer account, represented the confiscated assets of murdered people: wedding rings, dental gold, jewelry stripped from the bodies of those who had been killed in the camps. The gold had been smelted into anonymous bars, its origin deliberately obscured. The Merkers gold was eventually transported under heavy guard to the Reichsbank building in Frankfurt, and from there it began the long process of restitution that consumed years of post-war diplomatic energy. About 15 countries had gold seized by the Nazis from their central bank reserves, and the amounts recovered never fully matched the amounts stolen. The SS victim gold, the Melmer material, was handled separately, eventually contributing to relief and reconstruction funds for survivors. But Merkers was only one mine. Across Germany and occupied Europe, the Nazis had created an extensive network of hidden deposits. The salt mines at Altaussee in Austria held 6,577 paintings stolen from collections across Europe, intended for the Führer Museum that Hitler planned to build in Linz as the centerpiece of his imagined cultural legacy. This collection included works of the highest significance: Vermeer's The Astronomer, Michelangelo's Madonna of Bruges, Jan van Eyck's Ghent altarpiece, all packed in wooden crates marked marmor, Nick Sturzen, marble, do not drop, concealing the explosives that had been placed among them by a Nazi official who planned to destroy everything before the Allies arrived. The miners who worked at Altaussee saved the collection. When they discovered that the crates marked as marble actually contained explosives, they organized the removal and dismantling of the bombs before the detonation order could be carried out. The art survived. The broader landscape of Nazi hidden vaults extends beyond Germany itself. In Poland, stories of a hidden train laden with looted treasure have circulated for decades, connected to the Project Reese complex of tunnels dug beneath the Owl Mountains in Lower Silesia. In January 1945, as the Soviet advance approached, accounts from that period describe a train loaded with valuables being moved into the tunnel complex and subsequently disappearing. Whether this train exists, and whether it contains anything of significance, has been the subject of extensive ground-penetrating radar surveys and excavations that have produced ambiguous results. Lake Toplitz in Austria holds a history that is simultaneously documented and obscure. The lake was used by the German Navy as a testing ground for experimental torpedoes during the war, and at various points different materials were dumped in its depths. After the war ended, multiple diving expeditions searched the lake for valuables. At least 7 divers died in the attempts, caught in the submerged logs that fill the lake's lower depths. Some of what was found in the lake was genuine, including chests containing counterfeit British pound notes produced as part of Operation Bernhard. The German plan to destabilize the British economy by flooding it with high-quality forgeries. Some of what the divers were looking for was almost certainly not there at all, a product of the legends that grow up around any location associated with wartime concealment. But the documented history of what was put into that lake and the fact that some of it was not retrieved is real. The lake keeps its remaining secrets behind a barrier of submerged timber that has defeated every effort to penetrate its lower reaches. The Japanese imperial forces created their own network of wartime vaults across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. The so-called Yamashita's Gold, named for the Japanese general Tomoyuki Yamashita, is a legend of wartime plunder involving enormous quantities of gold, jewelry, and valuables looted from the territories Japan occupied between 1941 and 1945. The legend holds that this treasure was transported to the Philippines and hidden in a series of underground vaults, tunnels, and flooded chambers in anticipation of a Japanese defensive last stand that ultimately did not happen in the form anticipated. The documented history of Japanese wartime looting across Asia is extensive and well established. The specific claims about the Yamashita gold remain in the realm of legend, their evidentiary basis heavily disputed. Ferdinand Marcos, the former Philippine dictator, claimed to have recovered a significant portion of this treasure during his presidency, a claim that his family has continued to make and that has formed the basis of legal proceedings in Philippine courts. The reality of those claims remains unresolved. The Second World War was, among its other catastrophic characteristics, a great redistribution of wealth through theft, concealment, and destruction. The vaults built in those desperate years, the mines filled in haste, the tunnels dug in secrecy, the chambers sealed in the last hours before defeat, continue to surface in the historical record. Some have been found and their contents distributed according to post-war restitution frameworks. Some have been partially found and continue to be excavated. Some remain entirely unknown, their locations lost with the people who created them. Section 8. Government Secrets, Classified Vaults, and Official Mysteries. There is a room beneath the White House that most Americans have never thought about. The Presidential Emergency Operations Center, commonly referred to by its abbreviation PEOC, is a hardened underground command facility beneath the east wing of the White House. It is designed to serve as a secure location for the president and other key officials during a national emergency, capable of sustaining operations under conditions that would render the rest of the government inoperable. The existence of the facility is public knowledge. Its precise capabilities, the depth of its construction, its power and communication infrastructure, its relationship to other hardened government facilities in the Washington area, these details are classified. What is publicly documented about the PEOC comes from a relatively small number of sources. Official government disclosures that reveal the minimum, accounts from people who were inside it during actual emergencies, and the work of journalists and researchers who have assembled what is available. The most dramatic public account of the PEOC in use comes from the 11th of September 2001. Vice President Dick Cheney was moved into the facility shortly after the first plane struck the World Trade Center, and the accounts of that day from the people who were inside with him describe a bunker in the most literal architectural sense: low ceilings, electronic equipment, insufficient seating for the number of people present, the background hum of ventilation systems, the sense of being enclosed beneath a great weight of stone and concrete, while the world above went through something irreversible. The broader network of government-hardened facilities in the United States is one of the most intensively documented subjects in American national security journalism, and simultaneously one of the least-known aspects of the country's physical infrastructure. Congressional oversight committees, investigative journalists, freedom of information requests, declassified documents, all of these have contributed to a partial picture of a system that is, by design, partially invisible. Raven Rock Mountain Complex in Pennsylvania, also known as Site R or the Alternate Joint Communications Center, is a facility built into a granite mountain near the Pennsylvania-Maryland border that has served since the 1950s as an alternative command center for the president and senior military officials. The site has been described in general terms in numerous official and journalistic sources. It contains dormitories, a cafeteria, extensive communication equipment, and the physical infrastructure necessary to sustain operations for an extended period without external supply. Its specific capability and the current condition of its systems are not publicly documented in detail. Mount Weather Emergency Operations Center in Virginia is another of the surviving Cold War-hardened facilities a complex dug into the Blue Ridge Mountains that served as the primary evacuation destination for civilian government officials in the event of nuclear attack. Its existence was revealed publicly only after an accident in the 1970s that drew media attention to the site's location. The general outline of its purpose and its status as an operational facility are acknowledged. Its specific capabilities remain classified. The Cold War produced a remarkable body of secret architecture, chambers and tunnels and underground facilities built at enormous expense across both sides of the Iron Curtain, designed to preserve the ability of governments to continue operating through events that would, in practice, have been civilizationally terminal. These facilities were designed for a threat that, in the specific form envisioned, never materialized. Many of them are now declassified and decommissioned, open to historians and sometimes to tourists. The command bunker at Kelvedon Hatch in Essex, England, where the British government would have been relocated in the event of nuclear attack, is now a museum. The bunker under the Greenbrier Resort in West Virginia, built to house Congress during a nuclear emergency and maintained in secret for 30 years until a journalist revealed its existence in 1992, is also a museum now. These spaces, designed in absolute secrecy to protect governance from annihilation, ended their operational lives as tourist attractions. There is something in that transition that is both darkly comic and genuinely affecting. The bunker under the Greenbrier was operational from 1962 until 1992, maintained in a state of constant readiness for a nuclear war that would require the entirety of the United States Congress to abandon the surface of the Earth and continue operating from a room under a luxury hotel in West Virginia. Congressional members knew it existed. Very few were ever told where it was. The British government's own wartime archive of secrets has produced its own vault narratives. The Cabinet War Rooms, now a museum complex beneath Treasury buildings near Parliament in London, were the underground complex from which Winston Churchill's government operated during the most dangerous periods of the Second World War. The rooms are remarkably well preserved, and the experience of walking through them now is to encounter a space whose history is both formally acknowledged and viscerally strange. Churchill's private room, where he slept on certain nights, is exactly as it was left when the complex was closed, on the 16th of August, 1945, the day after Japan surrendered. The map room, where the progress of the war was tracked on large charts, still has its original fittings. The story of how these rooms survived so intact is itself a vault story. When the war ended, the staff who worked in the Cabinet War Rooms simply locked the doors and left. The complex was not demolished or repurposed. It was sealed. It remained sealed for decades, its existence known to those in government but not the subject of any public acknowledgement. When it was finally rediscovered and opened for historical assessment in the 1980s, the preservation was extraordinary. The pencils were still on the desks. The maps were still on the walls. Government vaults in the digital age have taken new forms. The National Security Agency's facilities in Fort Meade, Maryland, and in Bluffdale, Utah, the latter an enormous data center complex constructed for over $1 billion, hold information rather than physical objects. The Utah Data Center, opened in 2013, was designed to hold enormous volumes of intercepted communications and metadata, all of it sealed behind multiple layers of physical and electronic security. The concept of the vault, in this context, has become fully abstract. What is being locked away is not gold or documents, but patterns of information, the metadata of human communication stripped of its context, held indefinitely in facilities whose physical dimensions are enormous, but whose contents are invisible, intangible, and unimaginably dense. The principles, though, are the same ones that drove the ancient Egyptians to seal their treasuries behind disguised doors and the medieval monks to build their crypts beneath the most secure buildings they knew how to construct. What you value, you secure. What you secure, you hide. The vault is always a statement about power and about the limits of trust. Section 9. The Great Heists. When someone opened the door from the wrong side. On the evening of the 15th of February, 2003, in the Diamond District of Antwerp, Belgium, a group of men climbed into a building on Schoepstraat. What made this unremarkable as a physical act was what made it extraordinary as a criminal achievement. The man leading the group, Leonardo Notarbartolo, had been a tenant in the building for the previous 2 years. He had rented an office space on an upper floor, introduced himself to building staff as an Italian diamond merchant, paid his rent on time, greeted people in the corridors, and spent months systematically learning every detail of the security system protecting the vault 2 floors below the main floor. The vault at the Antwerp Diamond Center was considered by the security industry to be among the most secure private vaults in the world. It was protected by 10 separate security layers, an advanced combination lock requiring 2 operators simultaneously, infrared heat detectors, Doppler radar, seismic sensors capable of detecting vibrations consistent with drilling or cutting, a magnetic field between 2 plates that would trigger an alarm if disturbed, a keycard access system for the elevator serving the vault floor, and a private security force monitoring the building at all hours. Notar Bartolo and his team, later identified by Belgian prosecutors as members of a group the press called the School of Turin, spent 2 years analyzing each of these systems from their rented office overhead. They identified the specific mechanisms and their vulnerabilities. They built a replica of the vault somewhere in Italy and practiced their approach repeatedly. They acquired or fabricated the specialized tools required for each layer of the security. The thermal sensors were disabled by spraying hairspray onto them during a reconnaissance visit, coating the sensor surface with a film that prevented accurate temperature detection. The magnetic field, which worked by detecting if the gap between 2 plates was disturbed, was bypassed by removing the bottom screws of the plates during an earlier access and replacing them with temporary fasteners, then using a custom aluminum plate to keep the field intact while opening the door. The seismic sensors required that all movement be slow and deliberate, avoiding any vibration that could trigger detection. The combination lock had 100 million possible combinations. Notar Bartolo discovered that a member of the building staff had written the combination in a nearby closet, presumably as an aide-memoire against the possibility of forgetting it. The unbreakable lock was opened with information written on a piece of paper in a cupboard. Over the weekend of February 15th and 16th, the group entered the vault and worked methodically through its contents. They had devices to break open the individual safe deposit boxes inside, a hand-cranked tool designed for the purpose. They opened 109 of the 189 boxes, leaving the others undisturbed. The total value of diamonds, gold, and jewelry taken has been estimated at more than $100 million. They did not leave through the front entrance. They exited through paths that had been identified in advance, leaving no visible evidence of entry. The robbery was not discovered until the vault staff arrived on the Monday morning following the weekend. Most of the diamonds have never been recovered. Notar Bartolo and several members of his team were eventually identified and arrested, partly because of a single critical error. After the robbery, they discarded bags of materials from the safe house they had used. A local landowner found the discarded material, and among the detritus were items that pointed directly to Notar Bartolo. A half-eaten sandwich was found near the disposal site. DNA analysis confirmed his presence. The heist of the century was undone by a garbage bag. Notar Bartolo was convicted and sentenced to 10 years in prison. He served part of that sentence before being released on parole, subsequently violated his parole conditions, was arrested again in 2013 at Charles de Gaulle Airport during a layover, and served the remainder of his sentence. He gave an interview to Wired magazine in which he claimed that the robbery had actually been an insurance fraud, organized by a diamond merchant who wanted to claim on his own goods. Belgian prosecutors dismissed this claim, noting among other things that the vault had been denied an insurance policy due to security flaws that would have made insurance fraud practically and legally impossible. The diamonds remain unaccounted for. The Banco Central robbery in Fortaleza, Brazil, in August 2005 represents a different kind of criminal achievement entirely. Where Notar Bartolo's crew relied on infiltration, intelligence, and precision, the Fortaleza robbers relied on something older and more literal: digging. The gang rented a house approximately 80 meters from the Banco Central's Fortaleza branch, establishing themselves in the neighborhood over the preceding months as the operators of a landscaping business. The landscaping cover was necessary because excavating a tunnel through which you intend to commit a bank robbery produces a large amount of displaced soil and rock, and you need some explanation for why you are removing substantial quantities of earth from your property in large white trucks. The tunnel they dug over 3 months was 80 meters long, 2 meters wide, and 1 meter tall, equipped with electric lighting and ventilation systems. It ran directly beneath the street, beneath the foundations of adjacent buildings, and up through the reinforced concrete floor of the Banco Central's vault chamber. The vault held containers of used 50 real notes that had been withdrawn from circulation and were being held pending authentication and destruction. On the weekend of August 6th and 7th, the robbers came up through the floor, bypassed the vault's electronic security systems, which were designed to detect intrusion from the walls and ceiling rather than from below, and removed 5 containers of currency totaling approximately 160 million Brazilian reais, the equivalent of approximately $70 million. The vault floor, which had seemed to be resting solidly on the earth beneath a major bank, had in fact been approached from below. The thing the vault designers had not considered was that the threat could come from the direction where none of the sensors were pointing. Several gang members were eventually arrested, and some of the money was recovered. The majority was not. The operation, from its conception to its execution, had taken months of careful, physically demanding, technically sophisticated work. The gang had not hacked a system or exploited a procedural weakness. They had dug a hole. The Hatton Garden safe deposit burglary in London, which took place over the Easter weekend of April 2015, introduced to the world a group of criminals who became known in the British press as the Hatton Garden Weasers, a reference both to the jewelry district in which they operated and to their collective age. The average age of the team was over 65. The oldest was 76. The group targeted the vault of the Hatton Garden Safe Deposit Company, a private facility rented by jewelers and other businesses in the district as secure storage for valuables. Over the Easter bank holiday weekend, when the building would be unoccupied for 4 days, they used a heavy drill they had rented to bore through a reinforced concrete wall. The drill jammed at one point, and the team left, secured a different drill, and returned to complete the breach. They then descended by rope through a ventilation shaft into the vault and systematically worked through its contents over 2 nights. The total value of what was taken has been estimated at approximately £14 million in cash, jewelry, and other valuables. The vault had been specifically selected because its construction used less reinforced steel than might have been expected, a fact the team had apparently determined in advance through either inside information or reconnaissance. The robbers were arrested partly because they spoke freely about the robbery in locations they did not know were under surveillance, and partly because the police had the phones of one of the gang members under observation. They were convicted and sentenced to terms ranging from several years to over 7 years. The story generated extraordinary public interest. Several books were published, a film was made. The robbers themselves, elderly working-class men from various criminal backgrounds, became unlikely celebrities. Part of the fascination was the sheer audacity of the plan. Combined with the intimate human-scale quality of the execution, men in their late 60s and 70s descending on ropes through a ventilation shaft and drilling through a vault wall with a rented drill. Not every famous vault crime involves physical entry. The largest fraudulent misappropriation of assets from a secure financial institution in American history was not a heist in the traditional sense, but a systematic looting carried out over years by the people charged with protecting what was inside. Bernard Madoff's investment fund, which operated for decades before its collapse in 2008, was revealed to be a Ponzi scheme of extraordinary scale, taking in client funds that were never actually invested, using later deposits to pay the returns promised to earlier investors, maintaining the fiction through falsified statements and elaborate administrative concealment. When the scheme collapsed, client accounts that were supposed to hold approximately $65 billion were found to contain a small fraction of that amount. The vault in this case was the system of trust and documentation that Madoff's clients believed secured their assets. That vault contained nothing but paper. The theft that no one thinks of as a theft is sometimes the most total theft of all. Section 10. Vaults that were never found, the lost chambers of history. In 1701, craftsmen in the Prussian city of Berlin began constructing a room. The room was not a conventional space. Its walls were not stone or plaster, but amber, slabs of the fossilized tree resin ranging from pale yellow to deep cognac in color, cut and fitted together into panels of extraordinary intricacy. Behind the amber panels were layers of gold leaf and mirrors, creating depths of warm, honey-colored light that shifted as the candles moved. The craftsmen carved the amber into relief scenes. into columns and pilasters, into borders and medallions. There were mosaics assembled from pieces of amber and precious stones. There were paintings set into the amber framework. There were gilded bronzes and elaborately decorated frames. The completed space was approximately 180 square feet, a chamber whose every surface was a different configuration of amber and gold. It was described by visitors of the period as among the most beautiful rooms they had ever seen in any palace in Europe. Frederick I of Prussia commissioned it for the Berlin Palace. Frederick William I, his son and successor, gave it to the Russian Tsar Peter the Great in 1716 as a diplomatic gift, cementing an alliance. The Russians dismantled the room, packed it in 18 boxes, and transported it to St. Petersburg, where it was eventually installed in the Catherine Palace at Tsarskoye Selo, near the city. Over the following century, the room was expanded and elaborated by Russian craftsmen, growing from its original dimensions to cover approximately 180 square meters of wall space. Additional panels were added to cover sections of wall. New elements were commissioned to complete the overall effect. The room at its largest has been estimated to have contained approximately 6 tons of amber. In the early 1940s, as German forces advanced toward Leningrad during the Second World War, Soviet cultural officials attempted to dismantle and evacuate the amber room, as they had done with much of the palace's collection. The amber panels, however, could not be safely removed intact. They were too fragile for rapid dismantling. The decision was made to wallpaper over them, concealing the amber beneath paper in the hope that the occupation, if it came, would be brief. The occupation came. The German forces reached the Catherine Palace in September 1941, and a team of specialists from the German military's Kunstschutz, the art protection unit, identified the amber beneath the wallpaper within hours of arrival. The room was dismantled systematically over 36 hours, packed into wooden crates, and shipped west. The amber room arrived at Königsberg Castle in East Prussia, in what is now the Russian city of Kaliningrad, in November 1941. It was installed in a gallery on the castle's 3rd floor, where it was displayed to the public until 1944. After that point, the historical record becomes fragmentary and contested. As Allied forces advanced from the west and the Soviet army from the east in early 1945, the crates containing the dismantled amber room were reportedly moved from Königsberg Castle to a more secure location. What that location was, and whether the room survived the fall of Königsberg, is not definitively known. Königsberg was captured by Soviet forces in April 1945 after intense fighting that included large-scale fires and significant destruction of the city's historic buildings, including the castle. One persistent version of events holds that the amber room burned in the castle during the battle. Physical evidence from excavations of the castle site has been interpreted by some as supporting this conclusion. Another version holds that the room was evacuated before the Soviet assault, either by sea through the port of Königsberg or overland toward the German interior, and that it exists somewhere in a sealed chamber or vault that has not yet been found. Both versions are supported by some evidence. Neither version is conclusively established. The value of the amber room in its original form has been estimated at between $150 million and $500 million, making it one of the most valuable objects ever reported missing. A reconstruction was completed in 2003 using historical photographs and the skills of modern craftsmen, and this reproduction now occupies the original gallery in the restored Catherine Palace. It is regarded by those who have seen both the photographs of the original and the reconstruction as an extraordinary achievement of modern craftsmanship that nonetheless cannot fully convey what the original would have been. The original, if it survives, is somewhere. In a sealed chamber in a former Soviet basement, in a flooded tunnel in Poland, in a vault in South America, in a reinforced room beneath a private estate in Germany. The theories have been generating expeditions and competing claims for 80 years without resolution. Oak Island, a small island off the coast of Nova Scotia in Canada, has been the site of the world's longest-running treasure hunt for reasons that are somewhat difficult to explain clearly to someone encountering the story for the first time. The story begins in 1795, when a young man named Daniel McGinnis reportedly found a circular depression in the ground on the island and, believing it to indicate a buried cache of some kind, began digging. What he found was a vertical shaft with wooden platforms at regular intervals, apparently constructed deliberately descending into the earth. The shaft became known as the Money Pit, and the features encountered during subsequent excavations, the wooden platforms at 10-foot intervals, a stone inscribed with symbols, layers of putty and coconut fiber, an apparently engineered system of flood tunnels connected to the sea at a depth of approximately 90 feet, have been interpreted by successive generations of treasure hunters as evidence of an elaborate and deliberate effort to conceal something of great value. What that something might be has been the subject of extraordinary proliferation of theory. Pirate gold, most commonly attributed to Captain Kidd, who was hanged in 1701. The treasure of the Knights Templar, evacuated from Europe before the dissolution of the order. The Holy Grail, the Ark of the Covenant, Shakespeare's original manuscripts, the French colonial treasury from the fall of the fortress of Louisbourg, Marie Antoinette's jewels. The list of proposed contents grows with each generation of enthusiasts. More than 200 years of excavation and investigation have produced fragments of physical evidence. Wood from the shaft dated to the 18th century, a piece of gold chain, small quantities of other materials, but no vault, no treasure, no definitive explanation for the shaft's construction or purpose. The flood tunnel that prevents easy access to the deeper sections of the shaft has been interpreted alternately as evidence of sophisticated engineering by the original builders, who apparently designed it as a security measure, and as a natural geological feature misinterpreted as artificial. Most mainstream archaeologists have expressed skepticism about the treasure theories while acknowledging that the shaft is genuinely unusual in its construction. The mystery of Oak Island is not merely a treasure hunt. It is a case study in what happens when the idea of a vault, a hidden space containing something invaluable, lodges itself in the human imagination. People have spent millions of dollars and many decades of their lives pursuing what may be there or may be nothing. The vault that might exist somewhere below the water table of a small island in Nova Scotia has consumed more human attention than many actual historical discoveries. The lost Aztec treasury represents a different kind of missing vault, one whose contents are historically documented, but whose location was destroyed by the course of events rather than by concealment. On the night of the 30th of June, 1520, known in Spanish colonial history as La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows, Hernán Cortés led his forces in a retreat from the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. The Spanish had occupied the city for months, during which time they had systematically collected and partially melted down enormous quantities of gold and other precious objects from Montezuma's treasury. The gold was loaded onto horses and soldiers for the retreat. The retreat went catastrophically wrong. Aztec warriors discovered the Spanish moving through the city, and in the fighting on the narrow causeways over Lake Texcoco, soldiers and horses carrying gold fell into the water. The shallow lake bottom, covered with volcanic silt, absorbed the falling gold. Men drowned under the weight of what they were carrying. Soldiers threw their loads into the lake to save their lives. The Spanish returned and conquered the city the following year, and they searched the lake systematically for the gold. Some was recovered. A significant portion was not. The silt of Lake Texcoco absorbed it, and as the centuries passed and the lake was drained and the city of Mexico was built on the lakebed, the gold sank deeper beneath layers of urban construction. Mexico City is built on what was the floor of Lake Texcoco. The unrecovered gold of Tenochtitlan is, by most estimates, beneath several meters of urban infrastructure in what is now one of the largest cities in the world. Excavation is practically impossible on any significant scale. The vault that cannot be reached because a city was built over it. The Flor de la Mar was a Portuguese carrack, one of the largest and most heavily armed ships of its era, that sank off the coast of Sumatra in November 1511 during a storm while returning from the conquest of Malacca. The ship was carrying, according to contemporary accounts, an enormous quantity of treasure taken during the conquest: gold, precious stones, and royal objects confiscated from the Sultan of Malacca and the rulers of other conquered territories. The precise nature and value of the cargo has been estimated and re-estimated many times, with figures ranging from several $100 million to several $1 billion at current values. The wreck site has never been definitively located. The general area of the sinking is known, but the specific coordinates have not been established. Multiple expeditions have searched for the Flor de la Mar over the years, and competing international claims complicate any potential salvage operation. Indonesia, Malaysia, and Portugal all have potential claims on the wreck's contents. Somewhere off the coast of what is now the Indonesian province of Aceh, at a depth and location that remains undetermined, there is a shipwreck containing a cargo that has been sealed by the accident of historical catastrophe for more than 500 years. The vault that did not need to be locked because the sea locked it for free. Section 11. The Vaults of the Living World, What We Are Hiding Now. 130 meters inside a mountain on the Norwegian island of Spitsbergen, at approximately 78 degrees north latitude, roughly halfway between the Norwegian mainland and the North Pole, there is a tunnel. The tunnel leads through 5 reinforced locked doors, each requiring separate codes for access. Beyond the last door, the temperature drops to -18 degrees Celsius, and the air bites at the moisture inside your nostrils immediately. The space beyond those doors is carved into the heart of the Plataberget mountain, and on the shelves that line its walls, in sealed aluminum foil pouches, in labeled boxes organized by country of origin, there are approximately 1.2 million individual seed samples, representing a significant fraction of the world's crop diversity. The Svalbard Global Seed Vault opened on the 26th of February 2008. Its construction cost was $8.8 million. Funded entirely by the Norwegian government. It was built to solve a problem that agricultural scientists had been concerned about for decades: the fragility of the global network of seed banks on which the diversity of the world's food crops depends. Seed banks exist in approximately 1,700 locations worldwide, holding samples of crop varieties that are no longer in common cultivation but that carry genetic traits, disease resistance, drought tolerance, flavor characteristics, nutritional profiles that might be essential in a future where conditions are different from today. The problem is that seed banks are vulnerable. The National Seed Bank of the Philippines was damaged by flooding and destroyed by fire. The seed banks of Afghanistan and Iraq were lost entirely during the wars that consumed those countries. The International Seed Bank in Aleppo, Syria, became inaccessible when the Syrian civil war made the city a combat zone. The Svalbard Vault is the backup for all of these. Every seed bank in the world is invited to send duplicate samples, which are stored at Svalbard at no cost, under conditions that would preserve them even if the vault's cooling systems failed entirely, because the surrounding permafrost maintains the temperature independently. Brian Lainoff, who served as lead partnerships coordinator for the Crop Trust, one of the organizations managing the vault, described the collection in terms that catch something of its significance. He noted that the vault holds seeds from both North Korea and South Korea in adjacent positions on the same shelf, that the seeds cannot perceive the geopolitical distance between their countries of origin, that they are simply cold and safe, which is all they need to be. The first withdrawal from the vault was made in September 2015, when the International Center for Agricultural Research in Dry Areas requested the return of seeds it had deposited. The center had been headquartered in Aleppo, and the war had made its collection inaccessible. The seeds were returned to the center, which had relocated its operations to Beirut and Rabat, and they were planted in fields in Morocco and Lebanon. Agricultural research that had been ongoing before the war resumed with varieties of wheat and other crops that would otherwise have been permanently lost to the violence that consumed their original home. The seeds were taken to Svalbard as a precaution against a future that was then hypothetical. The future arrived. The vault fulfilled its purpose. In one of the few genuinely reassuring modern vault stories, the thing that was being protected turned out to be exactly what was needed, at exactly the moment it was needed. The vault holds, as one researcher described it, 13,000 years of agricultural history, the varieties of crops that human beings have developed over the entire span of recorded civilization, each one representing generations of selective breeding, adaptation to local conditions, and accumulated agricultural knowledge. The oldest seed samples in the vault are varieties that have not been grown commercially for decades, preserved because someone understood that what seems obsolete might become irreplaceable. Adjacent to the Svalbard Global Seed Vault is the Arctic World Archive, which stores digital data on film reels capable of lasting 1,000 years under proper conditions. The project stores the digital records of national archives, cultural organizations, and other institutions whose materials are considered significant enough to warrant long-term preservation. The GitHub Arctic Code Vault, which deposited a snapshot of every publicly available code repository in GitHub's database in February 2020, is among the collections stored there. This means that the current state of essentially all open-source software code, the technical infrastructure of the modern digital world, is preserved on analog film reels inside a mountain near the North Pole. The vault logic persists. The contents have changed. The instinct is identical to the one that drove the priests of ancient Sumer to seal their clay tablets behind temple walls and the Aztec nobility to build their treasury in the heart of a floating city. Some things are too important to risk leaving unprotected. The Iron Mountain facility in Boyers, Pennsylvania, occupies a former limestone mine complex that has been converted into the world's most comprehensive records storage facility. The facility, 60 feet below ground in a stable geological formation, covers approximately 1 million square feet of underground space. It holds documents, photographs, films, audio recordings, and digital media for approximately 95% of the Fortune 1000 companies, along with major cultural institutions, government agencies, and private clients. Among the specific items documented in the facility's holdings are original master recordings from major record labels, copies of federal income tax records, original negatives from major motion picture studios, and the master recordings of some of the most significant recorded music of the 20th century. The facility maintains stable temperature and humidity conditions year-round, independent of surface conditions. It has its own power generation capacity. It is staffed around the clock. The entrance, from the surface, looks like a small industrial building. The facility itself extends deep into the limestone formation, its corridors and storage rooms carved from the rock of a former mine that has been repurposed into perhaps the largest single vault in continuous operational use in the world. The digital age has created new kinds of vaults that have no physical dimension at all, encrypted hard drives whose contents are inaccessible without keys that exist only in the memory of single individuals. Cold wallets, holding cryptocurrency that represent billions of dollars in value, inaccessible because the person who held the key died without recording it. The concept of the vault has become fully dematerialized in some of its most consequential modern applications. Gerald Cotton, the founder of the Canadian cryptocurrency exchange Quadriga, died unexpectedly in December 2018 at the age of 30. He was the only person who held the encryption keys to the exchange's cold wallets, where approximately $190 million in cryptocurrency held on behalf of the exchange's 115,000 customers was stored. No keys, no access, no recovery. $190 million in digital value, sealed in cold wallets by the death of the person who held the means to open them. Whether Cotton's death was genuine has itself been the subject of significant and unresolved speculation. The vaults he controlled remain inaccessible regardless. The vault that cannot be opened because the person who knew how has gone. The same story that has been told since the ancient Celtic chieftain took the location of his buried treasure to his grave, changed in its technical particulars, unchanged in its essential structure. What you protect eventually protects itself against you. Section 12. The strangest things the vaults were keeping, unusual contents, and unexpected discoveries. In a safe deposit box, somewhere in New York City, there are eyes. Specifically, they are the eyes of Albert Einstein. After Einstein died on the 18th of April 1955, at Princeton Hospital in New Jersey, the pathologist who performed the autopsy was a man named Thomas Stoltz Harvey, who made the decision to remove Einstein's brain without the family's explicit consent, believing the scientific value of studying one of history's most significant minds was sufficient justification. The brain went with Harvey when he left Princeton, eventually cut into hundreds of sections that were distributed to various researchers over the following decades. The eyes were removed separately and given to Einstein's ophthalmologist, Henry Abrams, who had treated the physicist during his later years. Abrams kept the eyes in a safe deposit box in New York City. In 1994, he confirmed this publicly, describing the eyes as one of his most treasured possessions. Abrams died in 2009. The current status of the safe deposit box is not publicly known. His descendants presumably have access to the box, or the box has been claimed by the state's unclaimed property process. What the state of New York's Unclaimed Property Division would do upon opening a safe deposit box containing the preserved eyes of Albert Einstein has not been tested in any documented way. The United States has approximately 25 million safe deposit boxes currently in use. The variety of what they contain, documented through the testimony of bank employees, the accounts of estate administrators, and the regular process by which states claim and open abandoned boxes whose rental fees have gone unpaid, is a compendium of human life in miniature. States that operate unclaimed property processes regularly open abandoned safe deposit boxes and encounter the full range of what people decide is important enough to lock away. Silver bars and significant quantities of cash are common. Jewelry of all periods and qualities appears regularly. The Colorado Unclaimed Property Office documented in recent years the discovery of a Tiffany necklace set with diamonds, pearls, and emeralds, worth approximately $150,000 in a box, whose rental had lapsed. Stock certificates for companies long since merged or defunct. Letters so private that the writer apparently could not bring themselves to destroy them, but could not risk leaving them anywhere findable. Photographs of people and events whose significance to the box's owner cannot now be determined. Handwritten wills that were never submitted to probate. Personal diaries. One particularly affecting category of safe deposit box content is the romantic artifact left there in preparation for an event that never occurred. Engagement rings in boxes still in their original wrapping, accompanied by notes to fictional future recipients addressed only to my future wife or to be opened together, sealed there by someone whose circumstances changed before the planned occasion arrived. The lock on a safe deposit box does not know whether the situation it was asked to preserve has remained relevant. It holds what it was given with perfect indifference to whether the world outside has changed. The strangest contents documented in safe deposit boxes tend to fall into a few categories. The practically inexplicable, objects whose presence cannot be understood without knowing the owner's reasoning. Monopoly money, found in multiple boxes by bank staff who opened abandoned ones. Large quantities of rocks, selected apparently for personal significance. A complete set of carved wooden figures of uncertain origin. An old safe deposit box unit purchased at auction by a buyer who discovered, upon opening it, a series of envelopes containing photographs and letters from what appeared to be an extramarital affair conducted in the 1950s, complete enough to tell a partial story of a relationship maintained for years in total secrecy. The Fort Knox vault, during the Second World War, held objects very far from its primary purpose as a gold repository. When the risk of German submarine and air attack on East Coast cities was at its height, the government moved several of its most significant national documents to the relative safety of the Kentucky interior. For a period, Fort Knox held the original copy of the Declaration of Independence, the original copy of the United States Constitution, the Magna Carta, the Lincoln Cathedral copy, which had been brought to the United States on loan for a World's Fair, the original Gettysburg Address, the gold plates from which the Book of Mormon had supposedly been translated, and, in a detail that feels very specific to the anxieties of wartime, the crown, scepter, and other regalia of the exiled King Peter of Yugoslavia. The world's most heavily guarded gold vault became, for the duration of the war, a general-purpose vault for the things the United States government had decided were too important to risk leaving anywhere else. The Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston holds another kind of vault story, one that is still ongoing. On the night of the 18th of March 1990, two men dressed as police officers entered the museum and, in a theft that lasted 81 minutes, removed 13 works of art valued at approximately $500 million. Among the stolen pieces were Vermeer's The Concert, 3 works by Rembrandt, including his Storm on the Sea of Galilee, and works by Degas and Manet. The stolen paintings have never been recovered. The empty frames from which several of the works were cut still hang on the gallery walls, the Gardner Museum's policy being to leave the frames in place as a kind of testament to what is missing. The museum offers a reward of $10 million for information leading to the recovery of the works. The FBI considers the case open and active. The specific detail of the empty frames is significant. The vault of the museum was breached, its most valuable contents removed. Rather than covering over the evidence of the loss, the institution chose to make the loss permanent and visible. The empty frame is a kind of anti-vault, a space that announces its own emptiness, that refuses to hide the fact that something was there and is no longer. In December 2024, researchers working with an endoscopic camera in the crypts of Vilnius Cathedral in Lithuania found, as described in an earlier section of this story, medieval royal regalia hidden since 1939. The find was immediately characterized as priceless. The word priceless is interesting. It is used routinely to describe historical objects of unusual significance, but its literal meaning is more specific than that. The Vilnius crowns are priceless in the specific sense that they are not objects for sale. Their value is not denominated in any currency. They are symbols of identity and continuity, evidence of a statehood and sovereignty that were suppressed and threatened and survived. The vault in the cathedral wall that held them did not just preserve gold and jewels. It preserved something more abstract, the physical evidence of a nation's claim on its own history. This is ultimately what the most important vaults have always held. Not just material wealth, though the material wealth is real and significant. The deepest contents of the most carefully sealed chambers have always been evidence. Evidence that someone was here. Evidence that something mattered enough to protect. Evidence that the people who sealed the vault believed the future was worth speaking to. The Egyptian priest who sealed the shrine of Anubis in Tutankhamun's treasury chamber. The clerk who misfiled the Chinon parchment and unwittingly sealed it for 600 years. The Lithuanian clergy who hid the crowns under a cathedral staircase in 1939 with the Nazi forces days away. The agricultural scientists who conceived the Svalbard Vault as the world's insurance policy against the loss of the genetic heritage of food. All of them, across the centuries, making the same gesture, sealing something behind a door, saying, "This needs to survive." Some of the time it does. The vault under the Canterbury paving stones, found in 2026 during routine municipal improvements, is described in the archaeological reports as an empty void. Just a brick-lined chamber, sealed beneath a city square, whose contents, if it ever had any, are unknown. An empty room that has been waiting underground for however many decades or centuries it was constructed. The archaeologists who found it are investigating. They will not know what it was for, or what it held, until they have studied it further. It might have been a burial vault. It might have been a storage space. It might have been a hiding place for something that was eventually removed by the person who put it there, leaving only the container behind. Or it might have been built with intention and never used. A vault with nothing inside. A locked door that conceals only darkness and silence and the slow accumulation of time. Even that is a kind of secret. Because the question of what it was meant to hold, of what the person who built it imagined locking away, of what future they were planning for when they laid those bricks and closed that lid, is unanswerable now. The intention sealed itself inside along with the space, and neither will give up what it knows. The vault protects its contents from the world. The empty vault protects nothing except the idea of protection itself. And in some strange way that is harder to articulate than to feel, even the empty vault holds something. It holds the possibility of what might have been there. If this story stayed with you tonight, leave a like before you fall asleep. And if you want more nights like this one, more secrets, more history, more quiet journeys into the places the world keeps locked away, subscribe. It takes one tap. Every subscriber genuinely matters. Sleep well, wherever you are. End of script. Section 13. The Philosophy of the Vault. Why we seal, what we lose, what we keep. There is a philosophical dimension to the vault that the purely historical account leaves unaddressed, and it is worth spending some time there before we bring this story to a close. Every vault involves a fundamental act of imagination about time. The person who seals a vault, whether they are an Egyptian pharaoh directing the blocking of a passage with 3 massive granite plugs, or a Lithuanian priest wrapping medieval crowns in newspaper and hiding them under a cathedral staircase, or a Norwegian engineer overseeing the installation of the cooling system in a mountain above the Arctic Circle, is making a calculation about a future they cannot see. They are asking, what will tomorrow need? What will tomorrow value? What would tomorrow be diminished by losing? These are questions that are very difficult to answer accurately. History is full of examples of things that were carefully preserved but turned out to be worthless to the future that found them, and of things that were casually discarded and turned out to be irreplaceable. The deliberate vault is someone saying, with full intention and real effort, this is worth keeping. This matters enough to lock away. This should survive what is coming. The Svalbard Global Seed Vault was built on a specific and well-argued understanding of what the future would need. The agricultural scientists who drove its creation had watched seed banks be destroyed by war, flood, fire, and institutional collapse. They understood that the genetic diversity of the world's food crops was being eroded generation by generation as commercial agriculture narrowed toward a small number of highly productive varieties. They understood that diversity is resilience, that the variety of shapes and flavors and disease resistances that 10,000 years of human agriculture had produced was a resource whose value would only become clear when particular conditions arrived, conditions that could not be fully predicted. In September 2015, those conditions arrived. The Syrian civil war had displaced the International Agricultural Research Center in Aleppo, and the seed varieties stored there were suddenly inaccessible. The vault, which had been built for exactly this kind of emergency, worked. Seeds were withdrawn, transported to new growing locations, and the research continued. But the Svalbard Vault operates under its own constraints. It stores duplicates of what gene banks send it. If the original is lost and the duplicate at Svalbard has been improperly stored or labeled, the backup fails. The vault is only as good as the quality of what was put inside it and the accuracy of the documentation maintained about those contents. This is always the problem with vaults, ancient and modern. The vault does not evaluate its contents. It does not know whether what it holds is accurately described or whether the description has survived along with the object. The Chinon parchment sat misfiled in a box in the Vatican archive for centuries because someone, at some point in the 19th century, put it in the wrong place. The document and its location became separated. The vault held the parchment, but the indexing system, the map that would tell future researchers where to look, had failed. A vault without an accurate index is a vault whose contents are, from a practical standpoint, lost. Every vault is a letter to the future. Every sealed chamber is someone making a bet about what tomorrow will value. Sometimes the bet was right. Sometimes the future opened the door and found exactly what had been hoped for. Sometimes the future opened the door and found the opposite of what anyone would have wanted. The vault does not curate, it simply holds. Section 14. The vaults we cannot see institutional secrets and hidden records. There is a category of modern vault that deserves its own consideration. The institutional vault, the secured space or secured process maintained by an organization that has reasons for keeping the contents inaccessible that are not primarily about physical security. These are the vaults maintained by governments, corporations, religious institutions, and other organized bodies of power, where the barriers to access are legal, procedural, and political rather than steel and concrete. They are, in many ways, the most significant vaults in the modern world, because what they hold has the capacity to alter our understanding of history, policy, and institutional behavior in ways that physical treasure cannot. The National Archives of the United Kingdom releases government documents to public access after a standard period that has historically been 30 years, though the specific rules have changed over time, and different categories of documents are subject to different timelines. Within the released materials, certain documents are routinely withheld, redacted, held back. The released file arrives with sections blank, their contents described only as exempt from disclosure under whatever clause of whatever Freedom of Information framework applies. The reason this matters for a story about vaults is that the withheld section of a document is itself a kind of vault. It exists within a context that makes clear something is there. The blank space declares itself. It says, "There was something here, it has been removed. You cannot see it." This is different from a vault whose existence is unknown. The sealed document is a vault that announces itself. It is visible absence, negative space that communicates by its very blankness that a decision has been made about access and that the decision was not in your favor. The CIA declassification process releases documents from intelligence operations dating back decades, but the released documents are often so heavily redacted that the operational details that might make them historically significant are entirely removed. Dates, names, locations, and specific actions are blacked out. What remains is a scaffolding of administrative language surrounding a whole. The whole was the thing. The scaffolding is what you are permitted to have. Corporations maintain their own institutional vaults, trade secrets, proprietary formulas, research data, strategic plans, communications between executives. All of these are sealed behind the legal equivalent of vault doors. The formula for Coca-Cola has been maintained as a trade secret for more than a century. It is stored physically in a vault at the World of Coca-Cola Museum in Atlanta, Georgia. The vault is real. It is part of the museum's exhibits. Visitors can see its exterior. The formula inside is, in a very direct sense, the product of the cultural and legal architecture around the concept of commercial secrecy as much as the physical architecture of the vault. What makes this category of vault philosophically interesting is the question of who decides what goes in and what comes out. Physical vaults were historically built by the wealthy and powerful because they had things worth protecting and resources to protect them with. Institutional vaults are built by organizations that have both the things and the legitimate authority within certain legal frameworks to restrict access to them. The question of where that authority ends is one of the defining political questions of the contemporary world. Whistleblowers, investigative journalists, and freedom of information advocates have spent decades arguing that the authority to seal institutional vaults extends too far, that the things being withheld are not genuinely sensitive operational intelligence, but rather evidence of institutional failure, corruption, and harm that deserves scrutiny rather than concealment. The history gives some support to this argument. The documents about Pope Pius XII's responses during the Holocaust were sealed for decades, partly because of legitimate concerns about diplomatic sensitivity, and partly because of institutional reluctance to submit the Church's record in that period to external examination. When they were finally opened, what was found was painful and significant. The vault had not protected security, it had protected reputation. The British government's files on the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya and on the actions of colonial administration during that period were discovered in 2011 to have been systematically removed from Kenya before independence and stored in a classified facility in the United Kingdom rather than transferred to the Kenyan National Archives as standard protocol would have required. The documents, known as the Hanslope Park Files, contained evidence of atrocities committed by British colonial forces. They had been sealed not for security reasons, but to prevent their use as evidence in legal proceedings and historical accountability. When they were eventually made available following legal pressure and public reporting, they contributed to a long-overdue public reckoning with a chapter of British imperial history that the institutional vault had helped to defer for decades. The institutional vault, at its least accountable, becomes a place where everything goes, regardless of whether it needs to be there. The organizational impulse towards secrecy, once established, tends toward expansion rather than contraction. More things get sealed, fewer things get unsealed. The vault grows denser and darker over time until an accident, or a whistleblower, or a determined journalist, or a freedom of information request forces a door open that had been locked much longer than anything in the public interest required. The unsealing of institutional vaults is one of the great ongoing stories of modern democracy. Every document that moves from classified to unclassified, from restricted to accessible, from sealed to available, adds to the historical record in ways that matter. Sometimes what is found is significant and changes our understanding of events. Sometimes what is found is completely routine and raises only the question of why it was sealed in the first place. What is never found, when an institutional vault is opened, is nothing. There is always something. The act of sealing always implies the existence of content. Section 15. Final thoughts: the lock, the key, and the space between. Let us come back, at the end, to where we started. To the moment before you lift the lid, or turn the dial, or apply the key, or breach the wall. That moment has a quality to it that every story in this collection has been circling around. It is the moment in which the vault is still sealed, in which its contents are still potential rather than actual, still multiple rather than singular. Before you open a vault, it might contain anything. Before Howard Carter broke the seal on Tutankhamun's burial chamber, it might have been stripped bare by robbers who had reached it before him. Before the American engineers blasted through the masonry at Merkers, the room on the other side might have been empty. Before the Lithuanian researchers introduced their endoscopic camera into the crack in the crypt wall, the cavity might have held nothing but air. The moment before opening is the moment of maximum possibility. Everything might be there. Nothing might be there. The vault before it is opened is a space of almost infinite potential, and then you open it, and potential collapses into actual. You find what was there, or you find the absence of what should have been there. Either way, the uncertainty resolves. The story takes its fixed shape. Tutankhamun's treasury was full. Merker's was full. The crypt at Vilnius held the crowns. The Canterbury vault was empty. Each of those outcomes matters differently, but all of them are the vault fulfilling its function, which is to hold the question until the moment arrives for answering. The vault, in all its forms, from the prehistoric cave to the Svalbard mountain to the encrypted cold wallet, is a kind of question mark in solid form. It says, wait, not now, later. For this to make sense, you will need to be someone other than you are at this moment, or you will need to be in circumstances other than your current ones, or the thing inside will need to have become relevant in ways it has not yet become relevant. Sometimes the moment comes and the relevance is clear. The seeds from Aleppo were needed in Morocco and Lebanon. The Chinon parchment was needed to rehabilitate the historical memory of the Knights Templar. The Nazi gold was needed as evidence at Nuremberg. Sometimes, the moment comes and the relevance is different from what was anticipated. The crown jewels of England were sealed in the Tower of London to protect the symbolic authority of the British monarchy. What they became was a cultural landmark, an object of popular mythology that belongs to the imagination of everyone who has ever heard of them, far beyond the political institution that created and maintains them. Sometimes the moment comes and we are not sure what to make of what we find. The empty vault in Canterbury, that brick-lined chamber found under the paving stones during municipal improvements in early 2026, does not yet have a story attached to it. It is just a space, waiting to be understood. The archaeologists are working on it. The answer, when it comes, will be definite and real and probably somewhat ordinary. An old burial vault, a storage chamber associated with the church that once stood on the site, a drainage feature. But for now, for this brief interval between discovery and explanation, it is something more interesting than any of those things. It is pure potential, a sealed space with no known contents, a question mark under a city street, waiting for someone to supply the answer. The world is full of these spaces, sealed, waiting, holding their questions against the day when someone arrives with the tools, the knowledge, and the willingness to open them and find out what is inside. Some of them hold gold. Some of them hold seeds. Some of them hold the documentation of a civilization's crimes. Some of them hold love letters written to people who are gone. Some of them hold empty frames where paintings used to be. Some of them hold the preserved eyes of one of the greatest scientific minds of the 20th century in a safe deposit box in a city that is not looking for them. Some of them hold nothing. All of them hold something. Every vault holds at least this: the fact that someone, at some point in the past, decided that closing a door was the right thing to do, that what was inside was worth protecting, that there was a future worth addressing, that what they had was worth keeping. That decision, repeated by countless thousands of people across all of recorded human history, is the quietest and most persistent expression of hope that civilization has ever produced. We keep building vaults. We keep sealing things inside them. We keep betting that there will be a tomorrow, and that tomorrow will care about what we cared about today. The vault is the wager against oblivion. Sometimes it wins. The most remarkable thing about the history of vaults is not the gold or the diamonds or the secret parchments. It is not the audacious heists or the wartime concealments or the centuries-long mysteries. The most remarkable thing is the sheer accumulation of human intention that the history represents. Millions of individual decisions across thousands of years and dozens of civilizations to put something away and trust it to time. We are the beneficiaries of that accumulated intention. The seeds we can plant, the historical record we can read, the art we can see, the knowledge we can access, all of it depended, at some point in its journey to us, on someone deciding that it was worth sealing inside something sturdy enough to survive. The vaults were keeping all of this. They were keeping the things that mattered to the people who built them. And through the strange alchemy of time and stone and salt and permafrost and encrypted code, those things were kept. The dark secrets of the vaults are not the gold and the jewels, though those are real. The dark secret is the faith that what you seal away will outlast what is coming. The faith that there will be a future capable of opening the door. The faith that the future will be glad you did it. Every vault, from the painted cave to the Arctic mountain, is that faith made physical. That is, every secret the vaults were hiding. At least every secret that has been found, and a few that are still out there, behind doors that have not been opened yet. If you made it all the way here, thank you. Drop a like if any of this stayed with you. And if you want to wake up to more nights like this one, subscribe. It is a small thing that means more than you know. Sleep well. End of script. Section 16. What the Vikings were hiding: hoards, burial ships, and the Northern Vault tradition. There is a specific quality of light in the National Museum of Denmark in Copenhagen, in the room where the Vindelev hoard is displayed, that feels almost theatrical. The gold objects sit in their cases against a dark background, and when you look at the decorated gold discs, the bracteates, with their stamped images of figures and animals and runic inscriptions, the craftsmanship catches the light in ways that communicate across 1,200 years without needing a single word of translation. The Vindelev hoard was discovered in 2021 by amateur metal detectorist Ole Ginnerup Schitz, who had only just received his metal detector as a Christmas gift when he found the objects in a field near Vindelev in Jutland, Denmark. He was on his first serious outing with the detector when it signaled something. He dug. He found a piece of gold. He was initially uncertain whether it was genuine. It was genuine. The hoard comprised 22 objects weighing approximately 900 grams, including extraordinarily large gold bracteates, decorated gold discs worn as pendants, decorated with figures including what may be the oldest known inscription referencing the Norse god Odin, pushing that attestation back by roughly 150 years from the previous earliest known example. The objects date to the migration period, approximately 400 to 550 CE, a period of social disruption and population movement across Northern Europe that may explain why the hoard was buried in the first place. The hoard pattern is one of the defining features of the archaeological record in Scandinavia and the British Isles. Across these regions, metal objects, particularly gold and silver, were buried in the ground in large numbers during periods of uncertainty or conflict. The pattern suggests that burial was understood as a form of banking, a way of securing wealth against the immediate threat of theft or seizure with the intention of return at some point in the future. Many hoards were never reclaimed. The person who buried them was killed, or captured, or driven from the territory where they had buried their goods, or simply unable to return before death claimed them. The gold stayed in the ground, sealed by the accident of circumstance rather than by any intentional mechanism, until a field was plowed or a building was constructed, or an amateur with a metal detector walked across the right piece of farmland. The number of hoards discovered in England alone is remarkable. The Staffordshire hoard, found in a field in Staffordshire in 2009, is the largest collection of Anglo-Saxon gold and silver metalwork ever discovered. It contains over 3,500 individual pieces, the majority of them militaria, fittings from swords and helmets and other weapons, decorated with garnets and gold in designs of extraordinary complexity. The quality of the craftsmanship represented in the hoard places it at the very highest level of Anglo-Saxon artistic production. Where these objects came from and why they ended up in the ground together without their accompanying weapons is unknown. The most common interpretation is that they represent loot stripped from defeated warriors after a battle, accumulated in one place and then buried for safekeeping. They were never recovered by whoever buried them. They stayed in the ground for approximately 1,400 years before turning up in a field in the West Midlands. The Staffordshire hoard does not contain any women's jewelry, any domestic objects, any everyday items. It is exclusively military metalwork. This tells a story by exclusion. Someone sorted through the collected items, discarded or kept the non-military pieces, and buried only the weapons fittings. The reasoning behind that selection is irrecoverable, but its reality is expressed in the composition of the hoard itself. The Viking burial ship tradition represents a different and more elaborate approach to the vault. The Oseberg ship, excavated from a burial mound in Norway in 1904, was a 9th century Viking vessel approximately 22 meters long that had been used as the burial chamber for 2 women, at least one of them of very high social status. The ship was placed in a trench. The 2 women were buried inside it along with an extraordinary collection of objects, and the entire structure was then covered by a large earthen mound. What was found inside the Oseberg ship represents one of the most complete surviving examples of Viking Age material culture. Beds, carts, a sleigh, kitchen equipment, textiles, chests containing personal belongings, carved wooden objects of great artistic quality, the remains of multiple animals slaughtered for the burial. The ship itself, preserved in the blue clay of the burial mound, survived in extraordinary condition. The burial was designed to do everything a vault is designed to do: keep the contents together, protect them from the elements, preserve them against time. The blue clay of the Norwegian burial site turned out to be an almost ideal preservation medium, maintaining the wood of the ship and the organic objects within it against decay. What the Oseberg burial was not designed to do was prevent robbery. The burial mound had been entered in antiquity, and the most valuable small objects, the gold and silver and gemstones that the women would presumably have been buried with given their apparent status, were long gone when the archaeologists arrived. The robbers left the large wooden objects and the textiles because they were too bulky to remove easily. The thieves took what was small and dense and valuable in weight, and left what was large and fragile and valuable in cultural terms. The vault kept what the thieves did not want. History is sometimes grateful for the thieves' limited imagination. The treasure hoards of the British Isles and Scandinavia continue to be found. Metal detecting, carried out responsibly and in coordination with the archaeology community, has produced a steady stream of discoveries over the past several decades. The Portable Antiquities Scheme in England and Wales records over 1 million individual finds, of which a significant number are coins and other metalwork from buried deposits. Each find adds to the picture of a past that was actively engaged in the practice of burying wealth for safekeeping, a practice that generated vaults of varying sizes and varying degrees of sophistication across the entire landscape of the northern world. Most of those vaults held objects of personal rather than national significance: a farmer's savings, a merchant's cash, a warrior's share of the spoils of a campaign. The intimacy of scale is part of what makes these hoards affecting. They are not the treasuries of pharaohs or the crown jewels of kingdoms. They are the savings of ordinary people, made in moments of fear or practical calculation, sealed in the earth for a later day that never came. The vault did not know that the person who sealed it would not return. It simply held what it was given against the day of recovery that never arrived, until someone found it centuries or millennia later. The hoard is the democratic vault. Anyone could make one. Anyone could bury what they had and trust the earth to keep it. The earth kept it. It keeps it still, in all the places that have not yet been discovered, all the metal and pottery and organic material that the soil holds in its cold patience, waiting for someone to come looking. Section 17. The Digital Vault and What Comes Next: Encryption, Cold Storage, and the New Hidden World. At some point in the early 2010s, a person who was active in online cryptocurrency communities under the name Satoshi Nakamoto, and whose real identity has never been definitively established, estimated that they held approximately 1 million Bitcoin that had been mined in the earliest days of that currency's existence. Bitcoin was worth very little at that point. As of mid-2026, 1 million Bitcoin would represent a sum measured in the tens of billions of dollars, depending on the current price of the currency. Those coins exist in wallets secured by private cryptographic keys. The keys are the vault doors. Without them, the coins are inaccessible, regardless of their theoretical value. Whether Nakamoto holds those keys or whether those keys still exist in any accessible form is completely unknown. The Bitcoin blockchain records the existence of those coins. It records that they have never moved. It does not record anything about the person who controls them, the security of the keys that could release them, or whether those keys exist in a form that any person currently living can use. This is the digital vault in its most extreme form, a quantity of value whose existence is entirely public, documented on a distributed ledger that every node in a global network maintains a copy of, sealed behind a private key whose location and existence is unknown, potentially held by a person whose identity is unknown. The transparency of the digital vault is, paradoxically, what makes it impenetrable. The Nakamoto coins are not hidden. Everyone knows they are there. Every analyst who follows the Bitcoin network can see the addresses that hold them and can verify in real time that they have not moved. The vault, in this case, is not concealed. It is announced in full view of the entire world, and its inaccessibility comes from a mathematical property of the encryption rather than from any physical barrier. This is genuinely new in the history of vaults. The locked treasure room in the ancient temple was hidden. The safe deposit box in the bank is concealed behind multiple layers of access control. The Fort Knox vault is behind a perimeter that most people will never approach. But the Nakamoto coins are there, right there, their location precisely specified in a public database, and they are nonetheless unreachable by anyone who does not possess the specific mathematical string that constitutes the private key. The properties of modern asymmetric cryptography, the mathematical structures that underlie encrypted communication and digital wallets, are such that a private key of sufficient length cannot be guessed or computed in any time frame shorter than the age of the universe using currently available computational power. The key is either possessed or it is not. There is no picking the lock, there is no drilling through the wall, there is no social engineering of the guard. There is either the key or there is an absolutely impenetrable vault. The death of Gerald Cotton in 2018 and the inaccessibility of the Quadriga Exchange's cold wallets, which held approximately $190 million in cryptocurrency belonging to 115,000 clients, demonstrated one of the central vulnerabilities of the cryptographic vault. The key can be lost. If the person who holds it dies without leaving accessible backups, the vault seals itself permanently. Cotton was 30 when he died, in India, of Crohn's disease, under circumstances that some have found suspicious enough to warrant calls for exhumation and verification. Whether or not those suspicions are well-founded, the practical result is the same. The keys were with him, not in any accessible backup, and the coins are sealed. Several Canadian courts have been involved in proceedings related to the estate, and the process of recovering what can be recovered has been ongoing for years. The human factor in digital vault security is, characteristically, the same weak point it has always been. The time lock on the Fort Knox vault prevents coercion by making it physically impossible to open the door outside of its scheduled window. The cryptographic vault has no equivalent. If the key holder dies unexpectedly, the vault closes permanently. If the key holder shares the key with a trusted deputy, and that deputy is corrupted or compromised, the vault is breached. The mathematics are sound. The human arrangements around them are not always sound. Some of the oldest and most consequential encrypted vaults are the digital archives created by government and military intelligence agencies in the early decades of the digital era. Documents that were classified and stored digitally in the 1980s and 1990s used encryption standards that are, by contemporary measures, relatively weak. The challenge for archivists and historians is that some of those encrypted files exist in archives but cannot be decrypted because the original encryption keys have been lost and the standards used are old enough that brute force decryption is potentially feasible with modern hardware. The digital archive has, in some instances, created exactly the opposite problem from the paper archive. The paper archive risks deterioration over time. The digital archive risks encryption obsolescence. A document sealed with a strong 1990s encryption standard might be accessible to a moderately well-resourced attacker today in ways that the original encryption designers did not anticipate, precisely because computing power has increased dramatically in the intervening decades. The vault that seemed secure in its era of construction might prove less secure than expected as technology advances. This is not new. The granite plugs blocking the ascending passage of the Great Pyramid were, in their era, a formidable barrier. They held against casual attempts for a long time. Eventually, determined workers found ways around or through them. The plugs were impenetrable in the context of the technology available when they were installed. They were not impenetrable in all possible futures. The digital vault faces the same temporal challenge. An encryption standard strong enough today may not be strong enough in 50 years if quantum computing develops, as some researchers project. Governments and intelligence agencies are currently in the process of transitioning to post-quantum encryption standards precisely because the threat, though not yet realized, is taken seriously enough to warrant preparation. The vault is always in conversation with the capabilities of the future. The person building the vault can only secure it against the threats they can currently envision and the technology currently available to their adversaries. What comes after? The better drills? the more powerful computers, the unanticipated mathematical insights, those are beyond the vault's original design specifications. The best vault designers of every era have understood this implicitly. They have built as well as their knowledge allowed, and they have accepted that no vault is eternal. The goal is to hold what is inside long enough for the threat to pass, long enough for the circumstances to change, long enough for what is inside to be needed, long enough for someone qualified to come and open it properly. The digital vaults being built now, the encrypted archives, the cold wallets, the classified databases, the institutional record systems will be encountered by people in the future who may have capabilities we cannot currently anticipate. Some of what is sealed in those vaults will still be there, accessible to whoever holds the appropriate keys or develops the appropriate mathematical tools. Some of it will have been lost to technical obsolescence or institutional forgetting or simple human error. The record will be incomplete. The record has always been incomplete. Every sealed chamber that was successfully entered, every vault that was robbed or opened or discovered, every archive that was declassified or made accessible, has contributed something to the historical record. And every vault that was destroyed, every hoard that was melted down for its metal, every archive that burned, every cold wallet whose key was lost, represents a permanent gap. We are always working with a partial record. We always have been. The extraordinary thing is how much has survived. How many sealed chambers held against the centuries? How many buried hoards outlasted the wars and disasters that caused them to be buried? How many archives, despite neglect and fire and institutional indifference, preserved enough that the history they held could be reconstructed? The vault's record is imperfect, but genuine. It has kept more than it lost. The things that have come down to us through the imperfect medium of sealed chambers and encrypted files, and time-locked steel doors and buried earthenware pots, represent an extraordinary accumulation of what human beings, across their entire history on this planet, decided was worth keeping. It is an enormous inheritance, and there is more still to be found. Section 18. What happened to the things nobody found? The inventory of the missing. Let us spend some time with the things that are still missing. Not as a list of tragedies, necessarily, though some of them are genuinely tragic, but as an acknowledgement of the limits of what we know and of the ongoing work that history requires. The Amber Room is the most dramatic example of something that was definitively real, whose existence is thoroughly documented, whose history is precisely traceable up to a specific point, and whose subsequent fate is entirely unknown. An object that occupied a room in a Russian imperial palace that was seen and described and photographed by hundreds of people over more than 2 centuries, that was dismantled and crated and shipped westward by German specialists in 1941, that arrived in Königsberg Castle, that was photographed there in installation, that was reportedly moved again as the Soviet army advanced, and then simply vanished. The room had 6 tons of amber and gold. It is not possible to hide 6 tons of amber and gold without some significant trace. Either it was destroyed in the fighting for Königsberg, which would have left some physical evidence of burning that might be found in future archaeological work on the castle site, or it was moved somewhere that it has not yet been found. The searches over 80 years have not resolved the question. Multiple people over the decades have claimed to have information about its location. Claims have pointed to tunnels in Poland, to submarines that allegedly transported crates across the Baltic Sea, to private collections in Germany, to vaults in South America. None of these leads have been followed to a definitive conclusion. The Fleur de la Mar, as described earlier, represents a vault lost to the ocean rather than to human concealment. The ship sank. The cargo went with it. It is somewhere in the Strait of Malacca, at a depth and in a location that has not been determined despite multiple searches, using increasingly sophisticated underwater detection technology. The claim to the cargo, if it were found, would be contested between several nations and private interests. The searches continue. The treasure of the Knights Templar occupies a category between documented history and speculation. The Knights Templar were a medieval religious military order founded in 1119, who accumulated extraordinary wealth and institutional power over the course of the following 2 centuries. When the order was suppressed by papal authority in 1307, its assets were officially seized and distributed to other religious orders and to the French crown. What is not clear is whether all of the Templar assets were accounted for in that seizure. The order was large, Its properties were spread across Europe and the Holy Land, and its financial operations were sophisticated enough that the inventory of its holdings was never comprehensive. The possibility that significant assets were concealed before the suppression, hidden by members of the order who anticipated the coming persecution, is not inherently implausible. The specific claims made about Templar treasure, however, have gone far beyond what historical evidence supports. The suggestion that the Templars possessed the Holy Grail, the Ark of the Covenant, the True Cross, or other sacred relics of unique significance, and that these are hidden in specific locations that various researchers and treasure hunters have proposed, are not supported by credible historical evidence. They are mythology built on a foundation of genuine historical uncertainty. The genuine uncertainty is this. Some Templar assets were probably not accounted for in the official seizure of 1,307. Some may have been concealed by members of the order who survived the suppression and lived under other identities or under the protection of sympathetic rulers. What those concealed assets were and where they went is not known. That genuine uncertainty has been expanded by centuries of subsequent speculation into something much larger and more dramatic than the historical evidence justifies. Oak Island, as discussed, represents a similar dynamic. There is a genuine and documented excavation history at the site, dating back to the 1790s. There are genuine anomalies in the ground, structures that appear to have been deliberately created. What those structures were intended to secure, and whether anything remains there to be found, are questions that the 2+ centuries of excavation have not answered. The mundane explanations, a drainage system associated with historical salt works, a natural geological formation misinterpreted as artificial construction, a historical excavation for any of a number of ordinary purposes that simply happen to be abandoned, remain at least as plausible as the extraordinary ones. The legend of Oak Island has become self-sustaining, capable of generating interest and investment in the search regardless of what each successive excavation actually finds. The Inca gold represents a class of missing treasure that is historically well attested in its general outlines and practically impossible to recover in its specifics. The Spanish conquistadors documented the extraordinary wealth of the Inca Empire in considerable detail. They also documented their own systematic looting of that wealth. A significant portion of what they did not loot before the final collapse of Inca resistance was reportedly concealed by the Inca themselves, hidden in locations that were known only to those who did the concealing. The geography of the Andes makes systematic search for such caches extraordinarily difficult. The terrain is rugged, the climate is harsh, and the area in question covers hundreds of thousands of square kilometers. The communities whose ancestors may have preserved knowledge of hiding places, if such knowledge was preserved, are understandably reluctant to share it with outsiders who cannot demonstrate any legitimate claim on what might be found. The story of the lost treasure of Cocos Island, reportedly the Lima treasure concealed by a sea captain who agreed to transport it for safekeeping during Peruvian political upheaval in the 1820s, and then buried it on an uninhabited island in the Pacific, has generated more than 300 documented expeditions over the nearly 2 centuries since the story was first circulated. No treasure has been found. The island is now a protected nature reserve and excavation is prohibited. Blackbeard's legendary treasure, the accumulated plunder of Edward Teach's Caribbean piracy career, has been the subject of sustained search for 3 centuries. Blackbeard made hints in his own lifetime that he had accumulated substantial wealth and had hidden it somewhere known only to himself. Whether those hints were genuine or performance, and whether any such cache exists, is unknown. His flagship, the Queen Anne's Revenge, was excavated off the coast of North Carolina beginning in 1996, and the recovered artifacts confirm the ship's identity. But no significant treasure cache has been found. The missing treasures of history tend to fall into a few categories when examined carefully. There are the treasures that were almost certainly destroyed, either in the events surrounding their disappearance or, subsequently, whose legends persist because destruction is a less satisfying narrative conclusion than concealment and rediscovery. There are the treasures that were recovered but whose recovery was not widely documented, either because it happened privately or because the records of the recovery were lost. And there are the genuinely unresolved cases where something of documented historical significance has disappeared without adequate explanation and without recovery. The Amber Room almost certainly falls into one of the first two categories. Either it was destroyed in the chaos of the final weeks of the Second World War in Königsberg, or it was recovered by someone at some point after 1945 whose identity and the fact of their recovery have not entered the public historical record. The third option, that 6 tons of one of the most distinctive and well-documented objects in European art history are still sitting in an undiscovered vault somewhere, is the least plausible of the three, despite being the most romantically appealing. The genuinely unresolved cases, where the evidence is ambiguous and the range of possible explanations is broad, are the ones that continue to generate searches and speculation. The Oak Island Money Pit, the precise location of the Flor de la Marche, the fate of specific Aztec ritual objects, the location of Captain Kidd's purported buried treasure on Gardiner's Island or elsewhere. These are cases where the evidence does not clearly support either the maximalist interpretation or the dismissive one, and where continued investigation is genuinely possible. Most of the world's missing treasure is not in any of these dramatic categories. Most of it is the ordinary accumulation of ordinary loss. The hoards that were buried and never reclaimed, the objects that were passed down through families until the family died out and the objects were dispersed, the archives that burned or flooded or were simply lost through institutional negligence. The extraordinary missing treasures get the headlines. The ordinary missing material, the continuous background loss of the past against the attrition of time and circumstance, is the larger story, and it is ongoing. Things are being lost, right now, that future generations will wish had been preserved. Archives are being maintained inadequately. Objects are being sold without proper documentation. Languages are dying, whose last speakers hold knowledge of traditional practices and sites that will not be recoverable once those speakers are gone. The vault logic applies here too, but in reverse. The decision not to vault, not to preserve, not to seal against the future, is itself a decision with consequences. What is not sealed is left to the mercy of time and chance are not generally merciful. The most important vault work happening in the world right now is probably not the physical vault construction, not the gold storage or the seed preservation or the classified archive maintenance, though all of those matter. The most important vault work may be the less glamorous, more continuous work of deciding what is worth keeping, establishing the practices and institutions needed to keep it, and maintaining those practices and institutions against the inevitable pressures of cost, political priority, and institutional inertia. Every culture that has successfully preserved significant elements of its past through difficult periods has done so because some people, somewhere, made the decision that preservation was important enough to invest in and fight for. The monks who maintained libraries through the medieval period. The archivists who hid documents in chair drawers when Napoleon's forces came to seize the Vatican records. The miners who removed explosives from the Alta-Sea cave to save the stolen art. The agricultural scientists who spent years making the case for the Svalbard vault and then making sure it was built properly. These are not dramatic actions, in most cases. They are the patient, often unglamorous work of people who understood that the future would need what the present held and who acted accordingly. The vault is not a passive container. It requires active maintenance by people who care about what is inside it. The lock can rust. The climate control can fail. The legal framework that protects access can erode. The institutional memory that maintains the index can lapse. The vault requires keepers. All the vaults we have discussed, in one way or another, had keepers who made the difference between survival and loss. The key question for any vault is not just what it contains, but who watches over it and what they understand their obligation to be. The answer to that question, in any given case, is what determines whether what the vault holds will reach the future that was intended when the door was first closed. Appendeov. Section 19. The Long Sleep. A meditation on what time does to sealed spaces. There is a quality of silence in a sealed space that is unlike any other kind of silence. The silence of an empty field under an overcast sky is the silence of absence, of nothing happening. The silence of a concert hall after the last note has been played is the silence of completion, of something finished. The silence of a vault that has been sealed and left for a long time is something different from either of these. It is the silence of preserved potential, the silence of a situation suspended. The silence of a process arrested at a particular moment and held, without development, across whatever span of time the sealing has endured. When archaeologists enter a space that has been sealed for a long time, one of the things they consistently describe is this quality of temporal suspension. Howard Carter's account of opening the antechamber of Tutankhamun's tomb, his famous description of seeing wonderful things in the torchlight, conveys this. The disorder of the chamber, objects placed without the careful arrangement of a formal display, scattered and heaped as the embalmers and priests working under pressure had left them, was the disorder of a moment 3,000 years ago. A moment that had been preserved, exactly, for that entire span. The last person to touch any of those objects before Carter was a priest in ancient Egypt, working in the 14th century BCE, and whatever thought that person had as they placed the last oil lamp or the last alabaster vessel in its position before leaving and sealing the door is permanently irrecoverable. We know they were there. We know they did the work. We know they went out and sealed the door behind them. We do not know what they felt, or what they thought, or whether they believed the chamber would last, or whether the sealing was for them a moment of ceremony, or simply the last task of a long day. The vault holds the object but not the intention. It holds the material residue of a decision but not the deciding. This is one of the fundamental conditions of archaeology and of history. The evidence survives. The mind that generated the evidence does not. George Stout, the American art conservation officer who supervised the recovery of the stolen Nazi art from the Merkers salt mine in 1945, later described the physical experience of moving through the mine in terms that echo this temporal quality. The conditions inside the mine, cool, dry, dark, the artworks packed in wooden crates that preserved them perfectly, created a sense of extreme temporal dislocation. Objects painted by Titian in the 16th century, packed in 20th century wooden crates, retrieved by 21st century visitors today in a tourist attraction that was created from the infrastructure of the crime, represent an extraordinary compression of historical time into a single physical space. The crates in the mine were sealed. The paintings inside them were sealed inside the crates. The paintings themselves had been sealed in their frames and behind protective glass for centuries before the war removed them. They traveled through all of this, from one sealed condition to another, and survived. The resilience of properly preserved objects is itself one of the most extraordinary things in the vault story. Seeds in the Svalbard vault can survive, under the right conditions, for centuries. Some seeds have been germinated from specimens found in archaeological contexts dating back thousands of years. The oldest confirmed germination of an ancient seed involved a Judean date palm grown from a seed approximately 2,000 years old. The capacity of plant reproductive material to preserve viability across such spans is one of the more remarkable properties of organic chemistry. Gold survives essentially forever under any conditions. The gold buried in the Merkers salt mine in February 1945 was indistinguishable in its physical properties from the gold that was buried in the same form 3,000 years earlier in an Egyptian pharaoh's tomb. Gold does not rust or corrode or decay. It simply waits. It is, in this respect, the ideal vault material for storing itself. Organic materials, paper, wood, textiles, leather, are less patient. They require specific conditions to survive. Too much moisture, and they rot. Too little humidity, and they become brittle. Too much light, and they fade and degrade. Too much heat, and the chemical bonds that hold their structure together begin to break down. The survival of the organic materials in long-sealed vaults is, in most cases, a matter of extraordinary luck, of precisely the right environmental conditions persisting for the duration of the sealing. The Altamira cave painting survived because the cave maintained stable temperature and humidity, because the entrance was sealed by collapsed rock debris that prevented environmental fluctuations, and because no one entered the cave and introduced light, moisture, or microbiological contamination for tens of thousands of years. When modern visitors began entering the cave regularly after its discovery in the late 19th century, the microbiological load they introduced began affecting the paintings almost immediately. The cave is now closed to the general public, limited to a very small number of authorized visits per year, because the act of human observation was itself threatening the survival of the objects being observed. The vault, in this case, was more secure before it was discovered than after. The opening that made the contents known to the world was also, paradoxically, the event that began the process of their degradation. This is a recurring tension in vault history. The act of opening changes what is inside, not always chemically or physically, though sometimes that too, but always interpretively, contextually. An object in a sealed vault exists in a kind of interpretive suspension, its meaning not fully determined because its relationship to the world has been severed. When the vault opens and the object enters the stream of time again, it begins the process of acquiring a new set of meanings, new contexts, new relationships to the world that has changed around it. The Tutankhamun treasury objects, which spent 33 centuries in a sealed room, have now spent roughly a century in the stream of active human attention. In that century, they have been studied, debated, displayed, reproduced, photographed, analyzed, theorized about, and incorporated into the popular imagination to a degree that no other archaeological find has matched. They are simultaneously the specific material objects they were when they were made, the evidence they provide of ancient Egyptian material culture and royal burial practice, the icons they have become in modern popular culture, and the subjects of ongoing scholarly investigation. The vault held them in stasis. The opening released them into time. They are different things now than they were when the door was closed, not because their physical constitution has changed, but because the world of meaning they now inhabit has changed almost entirely. This is the final paradox of the vault. The ceiling preserves. The opening changes. The object that emerges from a vault is not quite the same object that went in, because the act of opening places it in a new relationship with meaning and context and human attention that its original sealed existence precluded. The Egyptian craftsman who placed the last oil lamp in Tutankhamun's antechamber was contributing to one project. Howard Carter, opening the same room in 1922, initiated a different one. The objects they shared between them, across 33 centuries, were simultaneously continuous with themselves and transformed by the journey. That transformation is perhaps the deepest thing the vault does. It holds things across the gap between one world and another. It bridges the circumstances that led to the sealing and the circumstances that led to the opening. It makes a kind of conversation possible between people separated by enormous spans of time who would otherwise have no means of reaching each other. The Egyptian priest who sealed the door spoke forward in time, through the medium of what was placed behind that door, to everyone who has since encountered what was inside. The Lithuanian clergy who hid the crowns in 1939 spoke forward to the researchers who found them in 2024, who returned them to the world as symbols of the nation whose continuity they had protected. The agricultural scientists who built the Svalbard Vault spoke forward to the Syrian researchers of 2015 who needed exactly what had been kept for them. These are not failures of direct communication. They are its alternative form. When direct communication is impossible, you seal what matters and trust it to the future. The vault is the letter that cannot be intercepted, the message that will reach its recipient regardless of what happens between the sending and the delivery. Some of those letters have been delivered. Some are still in transit, some were lost in the interval. The ones that were delivered changed the world that received them. The gold from Merkers funded reparations. The seeds from Aleppo restored research programs. The Chinon parchment restored a historical reputation. The honors of Scotland became symbols of a nation's persistence. The Tutankhamun treasury became a global icon of human achievement and the mystery of what lies beneath the surface of the world. The vaults were keeping all of this. Every last thing they held. They were keeping it for us, for the particular moment when what was sealed inside became relevant, valuable, or simply findable by someone who came to look. That is the dark secret of the vaults. They were never keeping anything from us. They were keeping everything for us. The door was always meant to open. The lock was always a promise about the future. The sealed chamber, in all its forms, from the prehistoric cave to the Arctic mountain to the encrypted digital wallet, was always addressed to whoever would one day come looking. Some of what is inside has already been found. Much of it is still waiting. The world beneath our feet, and the world behind our locked doors, and the world inside our encrypted files, is full of things sealed by people who believe the future would need them. The future is us. The need when we get there is real. Open carefully. Read slowly. The message has been traveling a long time. That is the story of every dark secret the vaults were hiding. If this kept you company tonight, or gave your mind something to drift toward in the quiet, leave a like on your way to sleep, and subscribe if you want to come back for more. there is always more to find. Good night. End of script. Supplemental. The vaults within vaults nested secrets and double-concealed chambers. No exploration of vault history would be complete without acknowledging one of its most persistent architectural patterns: the vault within the vault, the hidden room behind the hidden room, the chamber that only becomes visible after you have already opened the outer chamber and know where to look. This pattern appears so consistently across cultures and historical periods that it suggests something deep about the human instinct for securing what is most important. The most casual examination of a sealed space might find the outer layer of protection, the visible vault, without penetrating to the deeper concealment beneath it. Only someone who knew what they were looking for, or who was determined enough to examine every surface in every direction, would find the second layer. Egyptian pyramid architects employed nested concealment as a standard technique. The false passages in the Great Pyramid, including corridors that appear to lead toward burial chambers but terminate in blank walls, were not simply architectural errors. They were designed to draw intruders toward apparent targets, while the actual secured spaces lay in different directions. Someone entering the pyramid who did not already know its layout would find themselves navigating a system of choices, each of which might be the correct path or might be a deliberate misdirection. The same pattern appears in medieval castle design. The keep of a medieval castle was already the most heavily defended point within a heavily defended structure, but within the keep there would typically be further layers: a strong room with an iron-reinforced door, a treasury behind the strong room, a private vault or concealed chamber behind the treasury. A successful assault on the outer walls gained an attacker access to the outer courtyard. Reaching the keep required further effort. Reaching the strong room required defeating the keep's garrison. Reaching the private vault required finding it, which was not guaranteed. The nested vault principle was understood clearly by the Roman architect Vitruvius, whose 1st century BCE treatise on architecture described the placement of treasury rooms in the interior sections of buildings specifically to require an attacker to pass through multiple other spaces before reaching them. This was not merely common sense. It was explicit architectural doctrine. Medieval church and monastic builders extended this principle into extraordinary elaborations. The primary crypt was accessible by the main stair. The secondary crypt, where the most important relics or documents might be held, was accessible only through a concealed passage within the primary crypt. The tertiary storage, for the items that truly could not risk discovery, was accessible only to those with specific knowledge of the building's hidden architecture. Many of these secondary and tertiary spaces were never documented in any permanent record. The knowledge of their existence was maintained orally, passed from one generation of institutional leadership to the next. When the institutional line was broken, by death, by plague, by war, or by the suppression of a religious community, the knowledge was lost with the people who held it. The discovery of sealed chambers within churches and other historic buildings, by contractors installing heating systems, by archaeologists investigating beneath flooring, by researchers using ground-penetrating radar, regularly reveals spaces that have been genuinely unknown even to the current inhabitants of the buildings above them. The Exeter Cathedral crypt, rediscovered during excavations for an underfloor heating system in 2023, had been sealed and forgotten for approximately 700 years, while generations of cathedral staff walked over it. The inner vault at Tutankhamun's tomb within the Valley of the Kings was itself contained within an outer tomb that was itself hidden within a valley designed to be inaccessible. The sealed chamber within the sealed tomb within the hidden valley, 3 layers of concealment nested inside each other. The nesting principle reached perhaps its most extreme expression in the Japanese tradition of karakuri, the art of creating mechanical puzzles and hidden mechanisms, which was applied to the design of secret compartments in furniture and architectural elements. Karakuri furniture required specific sequences of movements, pressing particular panels in a specific order, sliding components in particular directions, to reveal concealed spaces. Without knowledge of the specific sequence, the compartment was effectively invisible. The physical space was no different from the surrounding furniture, but the knowledge to access it was entirely separate from the physical object itself. This separation of the key from the lock, the knowledge from the physical mechanism, is one of the central themes of vault history. The most secure vault is one where the combination, the code, The sequence, the key, exists nowhere that is findable to someone who does not already possess it. The information required to access the vault is itself the most important thing to protect. This is why the human factor has always been the decisive vulnerability in any security system. The vault door can be made impenetrable. The vault cannot be used if no one can open it. Someone must hold the knowledge of how to open it. And that someone is a human being, subject to all the vulnerabilities that human beings carry. The history of vault breaches is, in considerable measure, the history of that human vulnerability. The Antwerp Diamond Vault was opened with a combination that had been written down in a closet. The Fort Knox Vault requires multiple people, each holding only part of the access information, precisely because no single person can be compromised to provide full access. The medieval monastic treasury kept its location secret in human memory rather than written record, and when the humans who held that memory were gone, the vault was as secure as any unopened chamber, because no one who remained knew how to find it. The vault within a vault reaches its most philosophically interesting expression in the concept of the sealed text, the book that cannot be read. The document that exists and is documented to exist, but that cannot be examined because access has been permanently restricted or because the key to its interpretation has been lost. The Voynich manuscript, a hand-illustrated codex that has been carbon dated to the early 15th century, is written in a script and language that have defied all efforts at decipherment since the manuscript was rediscovered in 1912. Its text is clearly organized as a language, with the statistical regularities that characterize natural languages, but it corresponds to no known writing system or language. Its illustrations, depicting botanical subjects, astronomical charts, biological figures, and bathing figures, do not correspond clearly to any identifiable reference. The manuscript has been examined by professional cryptographers, computational linguists, historians of science, and enthusiastic amateurs for over a century. Several proposed decipherments have been published. None have achieved scholarly consensus. The manuscript remains unreadable. Whatever the Voynich manuscript contains, and there are genuine scholarly debates about whether it contains any meaning at all or whether it was created as a deliberate hoax, it functions as a vault in the purest possible sense. The information is present. The physical object exists and can be examined. But the key to what the object means, if it means anything, is absent. The vault is locked in the information, not in the container. This is the ultimate form of the vault. Not a physical seal, not a combination lock, not an encryption algorithm, but an epistemological barrier. You can see the object, you can handle it, you can examine it with every tool available. And you still cannot access what it holds, because the code for interpretation no longer exists in any recoverable form. The dark secret of that vault is not what is inside. The dark secret is that we may never know what is inside. The absence of the key is itself the final, irreversible seal, and yet people keep trying. The Voynich manuscript is still being analyzed. New computational approaches are being applied. New theories are being proposed. The human drive to open what is sealed, to know what is held, does not expire in the face of centuries of failure. This is, perhaps, the most human thing about the vault story. Not the engineering, not the theft, not the dramatic discoveries, though all of these matter. The most human thing is the persistence of the attempt, the refusal to accept the sealed door as a permanent condition, the belief that somewhere in the world, or in the archives, or in the digital records, or in the earth itself, there are things that were sealed for specific reasons by specific people, and that those reasons and those people are knowable if the evidence is examined carefully enough. The vault is a challenge. It always has been. Its sealing is an act of will and effort. The response to that act, the attempt to understand what is held and why and by whom and for whom, is an equivalent act of will and effort in the opposite direction. The sealed door does not want anything. It does not resist. It simply stands there, doing what it was built to do, which is to hold. The human beings on both sides of it, the ones who sealed it and the ones trying to open it, are the sources of intention and meaning and effort. Between them, and the silence of the sealed space between them, the entire story of the vault is contained. The story of vaults is, at its most compressed, the story of what human beings trust to outlast them. Every sealed chamber, every locked vault, every buried hoard is an expression of confidence in the future and in the durability of the container chosen to bridge the present to that future. The containers have changed across the millennia, from painted caves to granite pyramids to steel-reinforced bank rooms to encrypted cold wallets. The confidence has not changed. The act has not changed. The fundamental human gesture of sealing something away and trusting it forward into time remains one of the most consistent behaviors recorded in the archaeological and historical record. We are still doing it. Right now, this moment, somewhere in the world, someone is placing something valuable into a secured space and closing the door. A safe deposit box in a bank in Sao Paulo or Singapore or Stockholm. A climate-controlled archive somewhere in Washington or London or Beijing. A sealed, airtight pouch being placed in a box on a shelf in a mountain in Norway. A private key being written on a piece of paper and placed in an envelope inside a fireproof safe in someone's home. Each of these acts is the continuation of a tradition that stretches back to before recorded history began. Each of them is a message addressed to a future moment, a bet on tomorrow's existence and tomorrow's curiosity, a vote of confidence in the proposition that the world will continue, and that what is sealed now will be needed later. The vaults were keeping all of this, and somewhere sealed away right now is whatever comes next. Sleep well. The vaults are still holding,